For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Natural selection weeds out detrimental mutations and selects for beneficial mutations, but the neutral ones, having neither cost nor ill effect, may freely accumulate as junk.
Beneficial mutations, if they exist at all, are absolutely rare. Any evolutionist will admit to this. Natural selection is a fine-tuning process. It's a selection process. You can check out my debates for more on genetic entropy with some of the best evolutionary proponents out there. For example, I would recommend watching my debate with Dr. Stefan Frello, especially the discussion portion where we actually do talk about neutral mutations and just mutation accumulation in general. Natural selection, it can remove the worst, most detrimental and deleterious mutations, and it can amplify the best beneficial mutations, let's say antibiotic resistance, for example, but it can do nothing. It can do nothing against those near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations. They accumulate like rust on a car. That's why the damage is largely invisible. And Aron here, it is clear that he doesn't understand mutations. He doesn't understand genetics as much as he may believe that he does. And the human mutation rate is alarmingly high. It's roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. What this actually means is that mutations, they're entering the human population at a rate much, much faster than natural selection could ever possibly select away such mutations. It's like rust on a car. It's continuous and destruction. He believes that there are mutations that are absolutely neutral. And as I said earlier, as I said in my rebuttal to Godless Engineer, for example, that misunderstands the entire point at hand. Sure, it's neutral to the perspective of the organism's physical fitness or physical appearance, the phenotype, for example, but in no way can it be absolutely neutral to the genetic content or the genotype. These neutral mutations, the low impact near neutral mutations, the fact is that they have only a very tiny effect on fitness. It's like one single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. Is one single spelling mistake going to have an overall effect that's negative in the long run to that book the size of an encyclopedia? No, but it's the buildup, it's the accumulation of them that in the long run degenerates, destroys. So essentially, it comes down to the fact that harmful mutations, they're essentially invisible, absolutely invisible to the natural selection process. Nobody disagrees with natural selection. Nobody disagrees with a beneficial mutation here or there. They're mostly reductive, for example, sickle cell anemia. But at the end of the day, no amount of rare beneficial mutations can counterbalance the information loss. The information loss based on the influx of near neutral deleterious mutations. So at the end of the day, this all indicates strongly that, for one, the human genome, and apparently all genomes, must be accumulating harmful mutations continuously. And that such genomes, as I've stated before, they are slowly rusting out. And all of this has been verified. The inevitable genetic degeneration process, it's been validated by extensive numerical simulation experiments. And even in biological test systems, you can see these for yourselves. For example, Dr. John Sanford. Therefore, it all comes down to the fact that mutations, Aron here thinks that mutations are the creator, but they are the destroyer. They break things, they destroy. For example, bacteria. They can adapt, but what it is, it's adaptive degeneration. They lose genes short term for adaptive purposes, but it's long-term degeneration. Mutations are destruction and not construction. Sorry, Aron Ra. about how, mutations, a lot of them, they're not harmful, they're neutral, but that would misunderstand the entire point of, for one, genetic entropy, and two, neutral mutations in general. Because yes, most mutations are neutral from the perspective of the organism's physical fitness, right? The phenotype, of course, but all mutations they must have effect on the genetic content, which is the genotype. So in no way are mutations truly neutral. All must have an effect on the genotype. In regards to his, new information, beneficial mutations, the thing is, a lot of them now, even if I gave him a couple, for example, it's still not going to counterbalance the damage. But a lot of it now is based on epigenetic markers, and they're used and acted to control and regulate the activity of our genes, right? So our epigenome can influence our physical appearance in much the same way as our genes do, but with no change to the underlying genetic code. For example, diet alters our teeth, swimming alters our spleen size, high altitude alters our, chromosomes, hard work alters our bones. But the thing is, there's no large scale evolution. No new information is added, just expressed.
We define a beneficial mutation as a mutation that provides a benefit to the organism. In other words, I'm now resistant to an antibiotic, which is beneficial if that antibiotic's around. So if you look just at beneficial mutations, which is what evolutionists love to look at, beneficial, 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 and I say, but that's really irrelevant. What's happening at the genetic level? That's the key. It's not whether it's beneficial or not beneficial, it's what's happening genetically. And what we see, for example, with antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance comes by one of two ways for the most part. You have a vector come into the organism, which is bringing in some kind of gene that makes it resistant. Okay, well, that vector already exists. You're not introducing anything new into biology, it's already there. So that doesn't account for the origin of anything, it just counts for how it moves around, okay? The key thing then becomes mutations. That's why evolution is mutation and natural selection. Because if you do change the sequence, that has the potential to give you a whole new genetic component, a whole new genetic activity. But when we look at mutations that cause antibiotic resistance in bacteria, what they are is mutations that eliminate transport proteins, eliminate enzyme activities, eliminate functionality of certain proteins, eliminate, reduce, cut down, eliminate. See, is there a trend here? Okay. With lactose utilization in a human. The reason I can drink milk is because the normal regulatory system that shuts down the gene that makes the enzyme so you can digest lactose, when you move through puberty, that gene gets shut down. If you have the mutation, that blocks the shutting down. But what have you done? What you've done is you've eliminated a pre-existing system.
Another example of new variants is the glycophorin A somatic cell mutation, which has been identified in some Tibetans, which allows them to endure prolonged periods at altitudes over 7,000 feet without succumbing to apoplexia or altitude sickness.
Well, basically, epigenetic inheritance is this new unconventional way of looking at genetics. Up until now, mutations were considered the only thing that could be either positive or negative in regards to fitness, because without mutations, evolution can't occur. So this is where epigenetic comes from, and it goes against basically the idea that inheritance only happens through genetic mutations, or the DNA code passes on to the parent from offspring. This means that a parent's experiences in the form of epigenetic tags can be passed down to future generations. So epigenetics is the study of where factors influence a gene and how and when the gene is expressed. Regarding like the Sherpas of the high altitude people of the Nepal, the mainstream thought is that a single 1-point mutation led to a better adaptation for the high altitudes of the Tibetan people. But modern science has revealed that the epigenetic mechanisms are also behind this adaptation. It's not a beneficial mutation. You can read a peer-reviewed paper on this, on the epigenetic signatures of the high altitude adaptation of the Tibetan population. If you think about it like twins, twins have identical DNA. And think about it like one person turns 50 years old and so does the other one, right? But one will have cancer or heart disease, the other might not. One will go bald or be bipolar or start to lose their eyesight where the other doesn't. This is because of epigenetics. It's not inherited genetic mutations like we're told. Take, for example, the epigenome, which keeps a long life communication between environment and our genes that turn on and off tumor suppressing proteins. This is a reason why one twin will get cancer and the other will not, because epigenetic changes via the individual diet or environment will it'll cause this. So when you hear about beneficial genetic mutations, you are actually hearing about epigenetic regulation, not beneficial mutations. This is why the Sherpa people who have been called beneficial mutations that allow them to thrive at this high altitude, yet when they relocate and have children, they pass on none of these beneficial mutations, so-called, for these high altitudes, because they have no genetic requirement for living at such altitudes. So again, it was never a beneficial mutation. It was already present in the gene that got switched on. Evidence showing that it's nurture over nature. So to make matters worse for evolutionary theory, epigenetic modifications themselves are actually often resulted in DNA errors. And this leads to gradual but inevitable DNA degradation as well. So epigenetic adaptation will never result in any kind of evolution, because epigenetic mechanisms only regulate pre-existing biological information. Since epigenetics is not mutation-based, and there is no actual proof for beneficial mutations anymore, of all these things that we're talking about, like the lactose mutation. They claim that it was a single SNP, a single point mutation, resulting in lactose persistence, but that's wrong. It's epigenetics like all the rest. It's actually a methylation level, MCM6 and LCT genes. So the more they look into the epigenetics, the more that they find that it's that relation, and it's not a mutation at all.
And then there's a family in Connecticut who've been identified as having hyperdense, virtually unbreakable bones.
Fail again. This has nothing to do with beneficial mutations. This is just epigenetic regulation.
BCR5 delta 32 mutation. About 10% of whites of European origin now carry it, but the incidence is only 2% in Central Asia, and it is completely absent among East Asians, Africans, and tribal Americans. It appears to have suddenly become relatively common among white Europeans about 700 years ago, evidently as a result of the Black Plague, indicating another example of natural selection allowing one gene dominance in a changing environment. It is harmless or neutral in every respect other than its one clearly beneficial feature. According to ScienceFrontiers.com, if one inherits this gene from both parents, they will be especially resistant, if not immune, to AIDS.
There are people that are actually resistant to HIV. Do you know how they're resistant to HIV? They are missing the key protein the HIV virus binds to. And if the virus can't bind, it can't infect. Now, if you're exposed to HIV, that'd be pretty beneficial mutation, right? Sure. But what's it caused by? It's caused by loss of a pre-existing protein. And so what we see, and I can go on and on, what we see is repeatedly what the evolutionist community does is they offer example after example after example of what they claim, here's how evolution works. No, it's not. Because what you're doing is you're taking pre-existing systems and knocking them out or reducing them. You're not explaining how they evolved to begin with. It's the analogy of if you have a house, and in your house you have the dining room and a wall and then your recreation room. And your wife, being, the big socialite that she is, she wants a bigger dining room to entertain her parties. Well, you have a choice. I can keep my rec room, or I can knock at that wall and get a bigger dining room. Well, everybody knows happy wife is a happy home. So you knock out the inner wall and they have a bigger dining room. And it's beneficial because she's happy. But don't tell a carpenter that how you built the house was by knocking out a wall. But that's what evolutionists do repeatedly, is they give you an illustration of knocking out a wall, and this is how the house was built.
Genetic evidence is so reliable it can get a life or death sentence even without need of other types of evidence to corroborate it. So the unique fingerprints of mutation in molecular phylogeny are not only profound evidence of evolution, they amount to legal proof of it. Evolution of life is analogous to the evolution of language.
Oh good, I'm glad you think so, because language actually proves creation and completely falsifies evolution. If you don't think so, you're completely insane, and you should prove me wrong by debunking the video I made. It's only 10 minutes. I think you can make time for it, but I don't expect an answer.
So you said, Hovind would have to concede that evolution is not a religion. I'm at the 1 minute, 3 second mark of your 18-minute closing commentary. Took me an hour to take care of 1 minute, Mr. Nelson. Evolution is a religion. I'm not going to concede. I will never concede that it's not a religion, because it is a religion. You guys believe these things are related. You believe it very strongly. Will you ever concede that the first 5 meanings of the word are a religion? You're the one that needs to concede. You don't accept evolution. You believe in evolution. You kids got to watch them to use that word accept. You accept evolution? They're sneaking it in on you. Don't use the word accept. You believe. You do believe, I'm sure, but it's a religion. Mr. Nelson is very verbose. We just covered 1 minute of his closing comments. I'm not in a hurry to cover all 18 minutes, but I will, as needed, when I feel like it. You are low priority in my book. You have what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, Mr. Nelson. You think you know a whole lot more than you really know. There's nothing to cry about, okay? I can shut you up.
I challenge you.
You might want to warn your wife.
You're irrational.
Good, shut up. Okay. Wow. Correct your idiocy.
I should have known better.
Kind of like a mosquito. You gotta just once in a while, you gotta swat them.
Is there no one else? Is there no one else? Who are you, soldier?
Call me anytime. 855-BIG-DINO, extension 3. I'll be glad to explain it to you. This time we're going to talk about what Mr. Nelson has been saying, that apes and humans are related. Now, you know your ancestors better than me. I've never been to a family reunion of yours. However, my ancestors were not apes. None of them swung by their tails. Some might have swung by their necks, but none swung by their tails, okay? So in his closing arguments, he said that apes are related to humans. Now, Mr. Nelson, I told you it may take me a while because you are low priority, but
I'll be back.
And I'll keep coming back till we get it nailed. You said, point number 10, and this may take a little while, the different cladistic categories or taxonomic classifications of life that prove that humans are apes and that birds are dinosaurs are determined objectively according to a suite of morphological, embryological, and molecular data without anyone having to draw lines on paper. We covered some of that last night. We're going to take just the part I skipped. Probably shouldn't have skipped it, but the chart showing that humans are apes. No, we're not apes, Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. We're not.
Even him.
Hmm?
Even him.
Even you are not. Yeah. You sure? Okay. I had to think about that twice. You can pontificate all you want, stand on your soapbox and say, humans are apes, and that's what you do, I'm sure. And you probably really believe it. I don't question that. Most dictators and maniacs are good at forcefully, dogmatically, and even threateningly saying things until their disciples are afraid to question them. And that's what you're doing about this humans and apes. You talked about cladistics. It's not just a bunch of lines on paper. Yes, it is. They say, well, we've got evidence for those lines. You could draw lines all sorts of different ways and claim evidence, like I covered last night. But you're bamboozling people, and I want to talk about that here real quick. You are hoodwinking, bamboozling people. You said humans are apes. I'm sorry. No, that's not true. Right here. The charts evolutionists make are claiming relationships. They're pure imagination and are simply lines on paper. Humans are not apes. The hands are very different between humans and apes. Chimps versus humans. Are we different? Duh. But you can't see we're different. Well, let's look at some of the differences. How about the strength? We had a pet chimpanzee when I was growing up. No, a squirrel monkey. Henry the spider monkey. Henry the spider monkey. My brother had it as a pet. That thing was incredible. And the strength was phenomenal. If you held something close to the cage that it wanted, it would reach out and grab it and pull, and you couldn't get it away, and the thing was only this tall. According to Hunt, if you shave a chimp and take a photo of its body from the neck to the waist, at first glance, you wouldn't really notice it isn't human. The two species, musculature is extremely similar, but somehow, pound for pound, chimps are between 2 and 3 times stronger than humans. They are incredibly strong, pound for pound. Let's see, why are chimpanzees stronger than humans? Chimps are far stronger than we are, but why? And there's plenty on the internet about this topic. They don't look any different. The muscles don't look a lot bigger. The muscles are attached differently in quite a few cases, especially those for walking, etc., and holding their posture up, straight up and down. But they are just incredibly strong. So, Mr. Nelson, the muscle position and strength shows clearly we are not apes. You could work out every day, all day long, and not be as strong as an ape, the same size and same body weight. Conversation. You know, monkeys don't have conversation like we do. They cannot infer the mental state of another individual, whether they are happy or sad. This one atheist said, I believe that a theory of mind was the big breakthrough by our ancestors. One of the ape ancestors just decided to start thinking and wondering, what are other people thinking? Monkeys don't do that. Their brain is different. Why can't apes speak? Unlike humans, apes lack anatomical prerequisites for verbal language production. Fancy way of saying they don't have the hardware to speak. The organs within the vocal tract, such as larynx, muscles, and vocal cords, cannot be moved as freely and coordinated as in humans, especially not at a comparable speed. So they can't talk like we do. Will chimpanzees ever be able to speak? For decades, monkeys and apes' vocal anatomy has been blamed for their inability to produce human speech sounds. But a new study suggests macaque monkeys, and by extension other primates, could indeed talk if they only possess the brain. So not only do they not have the vocal wiring to do it, they don't have the brain to do it, the part of the brain that's missing that allows them to speak and recognize and understand verbal communication. So, Mr. Nelson, I'm sorry, humans are not apes. They have nothing similar to speech like we do. How about their stance, the way they stand? Humans are bipedal. Apes, and except for short bouts of uprightness, great apes walk on all fours. It's a profound disparity. Kevin Hunt, director of Human Origins and Primate Evolution Lab at Indiana University, thinks humans' ancestors stood upright in order to reach vegetation in low-hanging tree branches. Oh, so they learned to go from walking on 4 to walking on 2 so they could reach stuff on the tree branches. That's the story they've got. I'm sorry, that's a made-up story. That's not science. How about the houses monkeys make? That's an orangutan's house. Here's a human's house. Here's a chimpanzee house. Here is Alabama's largest house. Mr. Nelson, humans are not apes. No ape or any other animal builds houses anything similar to the way humans do. Nothing close, okay? What about using tools? Oh, look at that, he picked up a stick. Whoa, okay. I don't think apes' tools are anything similar to human tools, okay? We have a shop down. How many tools do we have in the shop? Thousands, bunch, okay? No animal comes close to humans in tool use. They might get a stick and shove it down a hole and try to get a few ants to stick to it. If you think that's similar to launching a space shuttle or building a skyscraper, you are absolutely insane. Completely bonkers, okay? Humans are not apes. No ape or any other animal uses tools anything similar to the way humans do. So stop saying humans are apes. No, we're not. Human feet are very different from chimpanzee feet. They did not evolve from a common ancestor. They have a common designer. The feet are very different. The bone structure, the joints, very different. The way that we walk and roll our foot compared to the way an ape does it, none of their feet are similar to ours. If you say, well, look, they've got 5 digits, 4 toes, and we've got 4 toes and a great toe. Well, this, again, could prove common designer, not common ancestor. Just in case you don't know, okay? This is the human foot over here. This is the ape's foot, okay? The feet are very different on the two. We have a large heel. They have a small heel. We have an ankle adapted for walking. Their ankle is adapted for climbing, the way the bones attach there. Stiff midfoot for propulsion when you push off of your stride. They have a flexible midfoot. Anyway, there's lots of differences in the ape foot and the human foot. I think the fact that there are a few similarities is evidence of a common designer. Same guy designed them and did a wonderful job, by the way. Apes' feet and human feet are very different. You can study the feet very carefully. and say, wow, you could imagine that one could evolve to the other, but that's pure imagination. They know the problem with feet when it comes to evolution. So when they found Lucy in 1973, Hadar Valley, Ethiopia, Donald Johanson found Lucy, became very famous for it. The only thing he ever did in his life of any recognition, I think. But they put human feet on the Lucy display at the St. Louis Zoo. And here's a general biology textbook. How did humans evolve? Hominid evolution. A reconstruction of Lucy on display at the St. Louis Zoo. A female skeleton found more than 20 years ago. Fossilized footprints from the ash. So they're equating Lucy to making these fossilized footprints, which were 100% normal human footprints. Whoa, this is deceit all the way through. Lucy, what nice feet you have. Many of the people, Science of Biology, different authors said, oh, Lucy had human feet. This is absolutely baloney. Not a single foot bone was found. None. They have to put it in there, though, because this is a major problem to go from a human foot to an ape foot. I'm sorry, Mr. Nelson. Humans are not apes. Their feet show us that very clearly, okay? The human pelvis is very different from chimpanzee pelvis. They did not evolve from a common ancestor. They have a common designer. Our pelvis is designed for walking upright. Theirs is designed for walking on all four. Our pelvis supports the organs inside, it holds them in place because of vertical up and down gravity pulling on them. The pelvis is very different. You could study this for a long time. And I'd like to know how on earth you think it changed from one to the other. From the human to the chimpanzee, or chimpanzee to the human, either way, the pelvis is very different. The way the muscles attach is very different. Just the pelvis shows very clearly, and their backbone, walking upright versus horizontal, shows we are not apes. I'm sorry. Now, you said it dogmatically, and like, Hovind's an idiot, everybody knows this, humans are apes. No, we're not apes. We're not. Stop saying stuff like that. Humans have a large cranium for the brain. Chimpanzees have a small cranium and a small brain. We have a flat forehead and face. They have a protruding brow and sloping face. We have a protruding nose. They have a broad, flat nose. The differences are immense just on the face of the two. The vertebral column and pelvis is very different because we walk with our head held straight above our body and they walk with their backbone horizontal. The placement of the foramen magnum is very different. Ours is up here where the spinal cord goes through into the brain. Theirs is way back here. How did this evolve slowly over millions of years? How did the foramen magnum change position? And where's the evidence for this? Ours is designed to hold the head straight up and down so your field of vision is perpendicular to your backbone. They walk with their backbone like this, so their head's up and they want to see their field of vision is parallel with their backbone. I'm sorry, Mr. Nelson, humans are not apes. The foramen magnum position shows us this very clearly. But they put them in the textbooks like we're related. They drew lines on paper. There we go. That's proof. They got a line on paper. Lord, we're even related to sponges. Whoa. Take a bath with your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa. Yeah, the sponge. Okay. You can believe that if you want, but that's not science.
The question of whether or not we are close genetic cousins of the great apes has bothered people for a long time. The answers to this question are perhaps even more interesting and reveal some of the inner workings behind the scenes that surround this contentious issue. So let me go back to the 1970s first. Even though we didn't have the full human DNA sequence until 2001, and then the chimpanzee sequence in 2005, there was enough indirect data available in the scientific literature back in the 70s to make some initial guesses. And from these initial technologies, which we don't even need to get into, it's an indirect way of getting at how similar we are, there was already this conclusion that there's a good chunk of our DNA that is very close to chimpanzee. Fast forward now to 2001, the human DNA sequence is published, and in the background to all of this is the advance of technology. So one of the earliest ways to sequence DNA, and this is important to understand to know why the scientific community has said different things at different times. If you go from the indirect scientific methods in the 1970s to the direct scientific methods, one of the early techniques for sequencing DNA directly was called Sanger sequencing. You'd have to have some sort of starting point. There's 3 billion letters in our DNA sequence, You'd have to have some point for which you already know the sequence, and you could sort of walk along and discover the next, let's say, 300, 700 letters, and you'd know what those letters are, and then you design you use it as your next starting point, and then you do the next 700 letters, and you can see just how slow and gradual this process of discovering a sequence is if it's 3 billion letters long. So for modern DNA sequencing advance, the scientific community has switched to a different technology. The human DNA sequence in 2001 utilized part of what I just mentioned, this slow walking method. But another technology that's been used is called shotgun sequencing, and as well next generation sequencing. So essentially what this is, you take a DNA sequence, you take a sample of DNA, you somehow bust it up into millions of tiny pieces, and ideally this might be, let's say, 50 letters, 100 letters, 150 letters long, and then you can multitask essentially. You can sequence all of these tiny little fragments in parallel, which dramatically speeds up the process. And then you electronically stitch back together the final sequence. So the early technology, the Sanger sequencing, where you sort of walk along 700 letters at a time, gives you a very clear, unambiguous answer at the end, but it's very slow. The newer technology, the next generation, the shotgun type technology, gives you an answer much more quickly, but it has this inherent ambiguity. Because if there are regions of our DNA that are very similar to one another, it may be hard to electronically separate an error in the sequencing process from a real difference, and it's hard to place exactly where in our sequence it should go if you're doing this basically blindly. Well, here's where the history comes even more to play. So the human DNA sequence is established, 2001. Chimpanzee comes along, and they use a type of shotgun sequencing, not the slow walking method, to get the chimpanzee. And then the question arises, let's say you've taken the chimpanzee DNA, you've busted it up into millions, billions of tiny little pieces that are each 50 to 150 letters long, let's say. How do you stitch the sequence back together? How do you know what it's supposed to look like? Well, the investigators assumed, the evolutionists assumed, humans and chimpanzees had a common ancestor, and therefore they could just use the already established human sequence to stitch chimpanzee back together. So baked into the cake from the start is the idea that we're very similar, and so you can just align them carefully. Now, what's ironic in all of this, and this is what really gave rise to the common claim that we're 99% genetically identical to chimpanzee. Those two studies, 2001 and 2005, and the 2005 one, where they're using human DNA to orient and stitch back together the pieces of the chimpanzee DNA. So what people knew in 2005 is here's a bunch of fragments of chimpanzee DNA, and if we use the human DNA as a template, we can put the puzzle back together in this manner, and it looks like it's 99%. Now, of course, there's a little bit of circular reasoning built into that, because you've essentially assumed the human and chimpanzee is very similar from the start. You've used the human as a template, sort of if you're putting a puzzle together. You're using the human DNA sequence as the cover for the box for the puzzle pieces, and you're using that to align on the chimpanzee puzzle pieces and figure out how it goes back together. Despite all of those built-in, somewhat circular assumptions in the methodology, despite all that, there were still chunks of chimpanzee DNA that could not find any match to human. That was typically excluded from the discussion. So that's another step to consider here. Not only was, first of all, the chimpanzee sequence built and stitched together on a human template, and the results of that is what they said was 99% identical, there were still, and this wasn't mentioned as much, fragments of chimpanzee DNA that could not match to human, and vice versa. There are parts of human that did not match chimpanzee. Analyzing those data, and one of my colleagues had done this extensively, analyzing these data, it looked like we were more around the order of 88% identical to chimpanzee. Now, that may not sound like a massive difference, 99% down to 87%. Well, isn't it still really similar? In terms of raw numbers, it's a huge difference. So if we're 88% identical to chimpanzee at the DNA level, 12% different, that means we're 300 to 400 million DNA letters different from the chimpanzee. It's a pretty big gap. Now, all of this has been thrown into more confusion by the latest advance in technology. They've basically gone back to the old way, in a sense, of sort of walking along the DNA, but they've got new tools now. The scientific community has new tools to sequence longer stretches. So instead of having a particular starting point, then discovering the next 700 letters of the sequence, and then picking that where it ends as the new starting point, and on you go, they can now do tens of thousands of letters in one sitting. Then you got a new starting point. Then you do the next tens of thousands of letters, new starting point, and on you go. It's a better way to stitch the genomes, the DNA back together. And that's now been done for chimpanzee, for human, I think for gorilla and orangutan, this newer technology that should allow you more of a bias-free stitching of the human and chimpanzee puzzles back together. However, from my reading of that particular paper that just came out in the last year or two, it seems that the authors punted and didn't even try to answer the question of whether, of just how similar, how identical, how different human and chimpanzee DNA is. So to summarize all this up, we've got several histories operating in parallel. We've got the history of DNA sequence discovery technology, which has advanced over time. That's in the background. The human DNA, and then there's the history of the actual human and chimpanzee DNA sequences. Human discovered first, chimpanzee, using the technology that exists at the time, is broken up into tons of tiny fragments assembled back together on the human template, but there's still this nagging element of the study that shows there's parts of chimpanzee that are just very different from human. And now there's this latest technology, and people aren't talking as much about just how similar humans and chimpanzees are. So what is the answer at the end of the day? I have a feeling what we'll discover is humans and chimpanzees will still have a very high percentage of their DNA in common. And this shouldn't surprise or intimidate anyone. Long before we had DNA sequencing technology, long before we even had the field of genetics, it was obvious from the anatomical and physiological levels that humans and the great apes, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, had a lot in common in terms of appearance, basic body structure, that sort of thing. There's still some major differences. For example, you can look at the great apes, the shape of their feet. They have feet that look like hands, used for grasping tree limbs and such, swinging through the trees, whereas humans have feet that are shaped and built for upright walking. So without even knowing what the DNA sequence is, and if you were just looking at our anatomy and physiology and say, well, what would you guess the DNA similarity to be between us and the great apes? You might predict from the outset there to be a high level of similarity because DNA is what encodes during the developmental process the anatomy and physiology that's built. We're similar anatomically and physiologically, therefore we should be similar genetically. It shouldn't surprise anyone. And that does not mean common ancestry. So here's where the rubber really meets the road when we think about what does it mean. Really the bigger question we're trying to answer is why are humans and great apes similar? It doesn't matter if you look at the anatomy, the physiology, the genetics, they all basically agree that we're pretty close. Exactly how close is still up in the air, but we're still fairly close. What should that imply about where we came from? And this is a question that has been confused by the evolutionary community for over a century. Somehow, I think evolutionists and maybe even lay public has approached this question thinking, okay, if we're made in the image of God, shouldn't we be obviously distinct from the rest of biology? And I'd say in one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. In the sense of no, I don't think the Bible implies that there's a certain pattern that's animal life, and humans should be equally distant from every single animal species out there. There should be no hierarchy. We're more similar to this species than another species. That's not implied by the text, and in fact, I think the text implies the opposite. The Bible doesn't say the patterns in which God created creatures in the beginning, but it does tell us we're made in His image, and so if we look at how humans have made things, created things, designed things, this might give us some inspiration into the patterns in which God may have created things in the beginning. So we naturally design things in groups within groups patterns. So if you were to look at the types of vehicles humans have designed even this year, you will quickly see they naturally form a groups within groups patterns. An automobile has a tremendous amount of similarity to other automobiles. I'm thinking of the American terms now, but an 18-wheeler or a semi-tractor trailer is obviously different from a car, but the car and a semi-tractor trailer are similar enough to each other that it sets them apart from an airplane. And there's this groups within groups patterns that emerges when you look at all the vehicles that humans have designed, and that's just a sort of a serendipitous empirical observation. We just naturally do this. So why wouldn't God do the same thing? Why wouldn't God design kinds of creatures in the beginning that are very different from us and some that are more similar to us? It helps us realize that we're distinct from nature. There's some things that are very different. There's some things that look more similar to us, but they're still not human. One of the things I wanted to do early on when I started professionally in the creation and evolution debate and started the Institute for Creation Research, now with Answers in Genesis, was to write a book called Chimps Don't Build Jets. People get preoccupied with the biology of humans and chimpanzees, and they miss the bigger picture. Humans build space shuttles. They go to the moon. They write symphonies. They make all sorts of fancy meals, and chimpanzees don't do any of those things. mankind has done all these things, and not a single chimpanzee has ever accomplished that, nor will they ever do that on their own, because they're fundamentally distinct from us. So the fact that there's this groups within groups pattern in nature, where we are closer to some species than to others, anatomy-wise, physiologically, genetically, that is actually a hallmark of design, because humans design things in groups within groups patterns. Why shouldn't God do the same thing? And so the fact that there exists this level of similarity that chimpanzees and humans share, that, let's say, humans and cows do not, that shouldn't bother anyone. This is what you'd expect life to look like if God created the world.
What do you think about the assumed chromosome 2 fusion? Is this evidence that man is related to apes?
But again, that has been disproven decades ago. That is so old, I'm surprised that anybody would even mention it. But the fact of the matter is that we are not genetically related to apes at all. Now, think about it for just a second. Let's run some numbers. Evolutionists would like you to think that as things got bigger, better, faster, smarter, we were adding DNA, accumulating it to get to the bigger, better, faster, smarter, correct? The more complex, more intelligent. Is that right? And yet, there are creatures that have far more genetic information. Apes have 11.5% more DNA than we do, but they certainly are not better than us. And the idea that is so commonly thrown around, oh, we are, I heard it on TV yesterday. This newsman who didn't have a clue what he was talking about said, well, you know, we're only 1 or 2% DNA different from apes. First of all, it was never true. Never true. It's a lie. Flat out lie. It was invented about 1998, 1999 with no evidence to support it whatsoever. However, what happened? As we started to understand the human genetic genome, we started to find out that it has vastly different characteristics to that of apes. So around the year 2000, instead of being 96, 97, 98, 99% the same as, say, chimpanzees, even the evolutionists, without any evidence beyond the fact that they could start telling that there were differences, only published it was 95.2. But what happened was, as they went on to 2005 and on to 2013, and I want to bring you up to date, the more we knew about the genetics of the human, and we knew the entire genome alphabet in 2003, but we didn't know the ape genome, every character, in 2003. So they were comparing incomplete information with complete information. And they were using the human DNA as a template to put the ape DNA in the order they wanted it to make it look like it came from us. But of course, that's not true. The DNA actually is on different chromosomes and so forth. And the concept apes have an extra set of chromosomes we don't have, and that somehow or another they melded together in the X chromosome. Well, what happens? The more we know, the more the numbers changed. So if you take a look at the publications, for instance, of the national proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, you find out that the numbers were going down as a percentage. And today, we can say the DNA of humans and apes is only 70% the same. Now, let's compare that for just a moment. That's 900 million DNA differences to start with. And even at rates which evolutionists believe material changes beneficially, there wouldn't be enough time to produce a human. And that's using their assumptions. But let's take a look. You don't start at zero when you compare living organisms when it comes to DNA. All living organisms, I don't care whether you're a bacteria, a plant, an animal, or a human being, all organisms that are biological share 25% the same DNA. So you don't start at zero to compare to begin with. I love the fact that you mentioned SpongeBob a little earlier, because I just wanted to break out laughing. And I'll explain why. Let's take a look and compare now the genomes that we do know compared to humans and apes. And I mentioned we now know that we're only 70% the same genetically in the genes with apes, right? But you're 50 to 60% the same as a banana. You're 35% the same as a daffodil or a narcissus. It's the same plant. But you are 86% the same as a rat. At least a rat's a mammal, is that correct? But you are 70% the same as a sea sponge. So maybe SpongeBob and we are related.
They tell us that man grunted language into existence. But who are they? Scientists. That's right, not linguists who actually study and specialize in language for a living. So are you going to take some paleontologist, zoologist, or anthropologist theory for human language development from people who know nothing about it nor study it? That's not logical. So before I get into why it's impossible developmentally, neurologically, mathematically, and statistically that language cannot arise on its own, ask yourself, why would man even wait hundreds of thousands of years before using the same skills of today to record history? Speech is a fundamental part of evolution. Even Darwin himself said speech is 95% plus of what lifts man above animals. So no one can say that language has nothing to do with evolution. It most certainly does. And linguistics requires intelligence. Where did that come from? Language as a code only comes from intelligence. What I have noticed from studying stochastic models is that human language could not have arose on its own, and the numbers required for it to have don't come even close to telling the real story. I'm not talking about communication. I am specifically talking about human language. Keep this in mind. Epoch 1 has nothing whatsoever to do with geology, paleontology, or time. It is a period used to denote the transition from a non-language, Epoch 0, to language, Epoch 1. An epoch is a period that represents a state. Epoch 0 has no grammar, and therefore no language. Epoch 1 is the first use of grammar, and accordingly the use of first language. The period between Epoch 0 and 1 is not a day, a week, or a year. It is any period of time. It is the gradations which require for the transition between the states. That is why it's called an epoch and not a year. After reviewing all possible stochastic models associated with the age of complexity restraints of human language acquisition, it is clear that there were not enough people and that human mental development could never have allowed humans to invent language. These models are what helped me determine this information to be a fact that no evolutionary theory nor debate can get around. I will get into more detail, but for now I think the first important lesson is on the Markov process. It's far more important to help you understand how this process can be used to show transitions between states from no language to language, which are epochs. Now, draw two circles side by side. In the left bubble, put the letter A. In the right bubble, put the letter B. Your bubbles represent states, state A and B. If we further define these states, we can say that state A represents an epoch of no language and state B represents an epoch of language. We begin with our entire population of the world in bubble A. They can only move to bubble B if they can pass the burdens associated with the age of complexity constraints, which are based on more than 250 years of medical, psychiatric, and linguistic observations. At Epoch 0, there aren't enough people in bubble A to overcome the burdens that move people to bubble B, and this number is not even remotely close. There are a lot of definitions in math associated with the full explanation, which I will elaborate a little bit on. But I do not want this to be boring or get lost on you. So, in a nutshell, it is a population problem where language cannot arise on its own. There weren't enough people at Epoch 0 to overcome the burden of the constraints, and the people don't get to graduate to bubble B for free. They would have to overcome and pass the constraints. If there weren't enough people to overcome the burden at Epoch 0, then language is not a byproduct of nature. If language is not a byproduct of nature, then language came from somewhere else. If language came from somewhere else, then evolution is false. And because it only takes one piece of evidence to falsify the theory of evolution, I have done just that with this irrefutable evidence. I guess the next best way for me to describe this model is by looking at the multiple cases of feral children, who are totally neglected, isolated children as well. Specifically, I want to look at Jeannie Weil's case, because I find this one the most interesting. Using Dr. Eric Lindbergh's and Professor Suzanne Cutress's work regarding the age of complexity restraints of language acquisition, and then applying the data to a small world population, hint, all world populations were considered small until agriculture began, then it forms an infinite no-language loop, from parent to child over and over and over again. There are no natural exits for this loop. Studies have found once a human is in the loop, they are trapped. There aren't enough people to overcome the statistical burdens. It's not even remotely close, even in a large-scale population. If it wasn't even in the ballpark, then I would give it a consideration. But it isn't, and that means there is no natural path to language acquisition. One would need a population size that is sufficient to meet the burdens that are imposed on the population. Language came from somewhere else, and it seems nature had nothing to do with it. You see, you were raised normally, which means that you were provided with language stimuli, and you met the standards for language fluency before you turned 5 years old. The defining difference between language acquisition L1 and the second language acquisition L2 is that the age of the person learning the language. For example, linguist Eric Lindbergh used second language to mean a language consciously acquired or used by its speaker after puberty. Language is only learned for L2. L1 is not learned, it is acquired. And there is a huge difference between learning a language and acquiring a language. Genie was a prime example of that difference. We are not talking about communication again, we're talking about language. You can use your L1 for the rest of your life to learn new abstract concepts, or for graduations to learn new language, L2. That is not the challenge. Before there was language, there was no language. The challenge was not to get primitive man to use L1, or new abstract words. Primitive man was like Genie, no language at all. She had no L1, nor did primitive man. Dr. Eric's challenge would have been to create grammar, because none existed. You can't compare primitive man challenges to your ability to use your L1 to learn new abstract things. I have noticed that from all the research that abstract words cannot be learned after puberty because abstract concepts cannot be understood or learned. That information I have gathered comes from the work of Dr. Lindbergh and his book Biological Foundations of Language, and more than 250 years of medical observations into all these studies have proven what I'm talking to you about. Let's say today you wanted to prove that human language can evolve and that it can form from nothing. What you would have to do is take every human being in the world and put them together. Now take everybody over the age of 13 and remove them. Now you're left with the people that have the ability to learn human language, because anybody after that age cannot grasp and learn the abstract concepts to learn language. So wolves do not have a language. They have primitive communication skills. Fish do not have language. They also have primitive communication skills. No professional linguist would say that wolves or fish have a language. To classify as a language, grammar must be present. Wolves and dolphins, for example, have no grammar. Even my friend's bird, who can pronounce words, again has no language. Only humans have grammar. So we know fish, birds, primates, and wolves can't talk about yesterday or tomorrow or the past activities or future activities. They can only make sounds about current activities or base nouns. Only human children possess the ability to learn grammar for L1. Adults can then take their knowledge of L1 and use translations to learn L2. But no language-deprived adult can ever learn grammar without L1. If a person has been deprived of language from the age of 13 years of life, then it's over. Another study has found that anatomically speaking, macaques are perfectly well equipped for human-like speech, even compared with a human. When stimulated, monkey voices sound flat and gravelly, but the words are clear and comprehensible. Then why can't they speak? Because their brains are not the same as ours. We were created different and in the image of God, and God taught Adam. And all of the observational research that exists just helps prove this point. This is a fact. Since observations and study began in 1644, not a single case of a child over the age of 13 has ever been able to learn language. And that is not based on some creationism or religious belief. This is all based off medical observation over the past 250 plus years. Based on all accepted criteria for falsifying evolution theory by professional scientists, this problem beats that criteria, because for evolution to be true, there had to be a natural path to everything that all species possess. Knowing all of this, imagine now the idea that propagates today, that all humans unconnected worldwide all manage to form language independently and roughly all at the same time without knowledge from one another. As is obvious now, that theory is obsolete.
The only way Aron Ra here, and any other evolutionist for that matter, can still say that humans are apes is to ignore 99.5% of the current data field. For example, the fact that they say humans and chimpanzees have genetic identity that's approximately 98 to 99% similarity. The fact of the matter is that the actual identity is only about 88% similar. And you might think to yourself, well, that's still slightly similar, but the thing is, that is over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the two species, because when they figure out that number, that is based on preferential and selective treatment of data. That's why when you don't just use cherry-pick data, for example, sequences that they expect to be similar based on their bias, their evolutionary bias, that's how you come to the 88% similarity, which destroys ape to man evolution. And to not go too deep into it, what they don't include is non-aligned DNA gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. The reality is the fact that humans are not apes, and they were created separately and uniquely in the image of God, just as the Bible records. The Y chromosome, for example. The Y chromosome disproves ape to man human evolution, because the significantly different DNA sequence of the Y chromosomes is remarkable and extensive. This is a serious problem for common ancestry, because given the low level of recombination and DNA sequence diversity on this Y chromosome, the human evolution paradigm is faced with a fatal blow and serious problem, because the human and chimp Y chromosomes should be a lot more similar to each other if human evolution was actually true. They should be the most similar chromosomes in the genome because they are so stable. For example, small amount of variation. But the fact is the Y chromosome is remarkably different between the humans and the chimps. It's approximately 70%. This is a fatal blow. We can look at orphan genes. Orphan genes are fully functional gene sequences that code for both a functional messenger RNA and a protein. And they lack similar counterparts in other organisms. Now, orphan genes that are specific to humans are very convincing evidence against the idea that we evolved from apes. Aron Ra says that we're still apes, but as you can see, genetics proves biblical creation and disproves ape to man evolution. Now, these orphan genes, the reason why these orphan genes are very powerful evidence against this idea that Aron Ra puts forth is because these genes appear fully formed and uniquely integrated into the complexity of the human genomic network, and clearly functional and important to various cellular processes. There is absolutely no evidence. This is just icing on the cake, given everything that has already been talked about. But there's no evidence for common ancestry with apes or any other creatures. This amazing category of genes, these orphan genes, are taxonomically restricted genes that are unique to each type of organisms. And these genes appear suddenly without any trace of ancestry in apes or any other animal. And Aron Ra can look to a hypothetical SpongeBob La La Land imagination fairy tale, but they don't fit that hypothetical fairy tale. These orphan genes are evidently part of the genomic landscape and is indicative of each created kind. It fits the biblical model of created kinds. This type of category of genes, they're needed for the uniqueness associated with each created kind, as we can read in the book of Genesis. They will also say, given Aron Ra's list of evidence here, showing that, quote unquote, humans are apes, is that humans are genetically closer to apes. He'll look to nested hierarchies, because a human is genetically closer to a chimpanzee than a human is to, say, a dog, or a whale, or a banana plant. That nested hierarchical classification system that we see in life. And they'll say that that irrefutably demonstrates common ancestry. But the fact is, these relative hierarchies are characteristics of design. If you look at molecular evidence, as Aron Ra points to here, he'll say human chromosome 2 arose through a fusion of two ape-like ancestors. But the alleged site where the fusion supposedly theoretically has taken place actually represents a highly organized functional gene, and there is a significant lack of evidence for a cryptic centromere site. Therefore, that purported fusion site, it's actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. Once again, genetics proves that man is created separately from apes and any other animal. They'll also say, we've all heard it, Aron Ra says humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes. How do you explain this? Pseudogenes, for example. But pseudogenes are now known, based on further scientific discovery, to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. The junk DNA era, the junk DNA paradigm has been completely overturned. We have only just begun to discover just how amazingly functional the human genome is, and it's mind-boggling. It's flabbergasting how many experiments would be required to actually conclude with any level of confidence that a particular set of DNA sequences has absolutely no function. For example, when they look to molecular phylogenetics, molecular data to prove their ape to man ancestry, they'll say gene order along chromosomes has no function. And they conclude that shared gene order demonstrates common ancestry, but the gene order along chromosomes has very important functional roles. Like I said, all this evidence points to biblical creation. And preliminary biochemical evidence for function doesn't just exist for the known functional pseudogenes, but also for at least 80% of all the pseudogenes in humans. And given this known data, it's obvious and evident to anybody with common sense who's not anti-science that the other 20% may still yet to be found to be functional in some human tissue or even under some physiological condition that has not yet been studied thoroughly. For example, many non-coding RNA genes, such as these pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. Shared endogenous retroviruses, ERVs, that Aron Ra will point to. It's one failure after another. These ERVs play important functional roles as well. They're important DNA elements, not mistakes. They don't prove universal common ancestry. Those pseudogenes, those so-called fossil sequences, they're not pseudo after all. As I've stated many times in debates and discussions with some of the top evolutionary proponents and defenders, these genes are necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Aron Ra's so-called ape-to-man ancestry, the fairy tale that he wants to hope, dream, and imagine is true, is dead. They've looked at beta-globin pseudogene, the supposed broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. They're now known to be functional DNA elements, all contrary to what evolutionists would have you believe. The gulo pseudogene, for example, the evolutionists use a very small amount of highly selective data. It's all preferential and selective treatment of data, and it only represents a very minute piece of the entire gulo gene regions and patterns of the gulo gene atrophy in the various types of animals in which they occur, taxonomically restricted in their genomic signatures and lack evidence of common ancestry. The data is actually significantly consistent with the notion that they are independent events. It's based on cherry-picked data. And if it occurred millions of years ago, this gulo pseudogene, the exons would be much more degraded. The gulo pseudogene that Aron would look to is obvious and very strong evidence for genetic discontinuity between humans and apes, not the inheritance of shared mistakes. This is all consistent with genetic entropy and systematic discontinuity, not ape to man evolution that he'll have you believe. At the end of the day, we are devolving and not evolving. Mutations are not construction. They're not the creator. We are accumulating mutations per generation. Humans, for example, 100 new mutations per person per generation, and these near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations, they're unselectable. They build up in the genome. We are degrading. These so-called human ape ancestors that they can look to, it's all evidence of a biblical creation model. For example, the hobbits that they look to, the early human population, what we now know is that they were inbred and apparently suffered from a special type of genetic degeneration called reductive evolution, which results in reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various pathologies. These bones found in the dirt that they'll look to, it's more consistent with a biblical creation model of post-flood, post-Babel isolation, inbred effects, for example. Even the early human population referred to as the Neanderthal, there's a paper that describes them as highly inbred, had a very high genetic load. This severe genetic degeneration, probably post-Babel and due to inbreeding and isolation, contributed to the disappearance of this human population. Homo erectus, for example, seems to have suffered from reductive evolution. They were inbred. The genetic degeneration of erectus was less advanced, of course, which indicates the more moderate reductions in body size, brain size, and other pathologies. But many paleoanthropologists would fold both Hobbit and Naledi, for example, into the more diverse erectus category. This is all we see. Genetic degeneration, the fact that we're going down since the fall, there's no evidence for ape to man ancestry. It's about time these evolutionists quit denying the science.
It's totally made up. Pure fiction. It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up. We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It never happened. It never happened. This one was invented. It never happened. It's false. It never happened. It's a fake.
Okay, positive mutations that we've observed. In the lab, Pseudomonas aeruginosa bacteria evolved the necessary enzymes to eat previously unusable synthetic nylon. A mutation that makes a bear's fur white is very helpful in the Arctic and very detrimental in the forest.
Okay, so yeah, obviously we agree that they're environmentally dependent, but it comes down to, once again, net loss versus net gain. Okay, if you're going up a mountain and you're taking one step up and 10 steps backward, it's not going to help you. And the majority proves the rule. And he used the we know nylon digestion is a loss of specificity, but in regards to the melanoprotein, and I'll let you kind of go into this, but I know for a fact that in gaining this antioxidant activity, the protein involved in this, it lost a lot of activity for making HDLs. So the mutant protein is actually, just like the nylon digestion, sacrifice specificity. So once again, net loss versus net gains not looking too well for evolution, right, Matt?
Absolutely. For the first thing, that bacteria that he's talking about, that doesn't exactly digest nylon. It digests broken down bits of the nylon molecule. It's just sloppy scholarship that they wanted to sell, so they advertised it differently. They've also found that there's over 355 different bacterial species that have the exact same genes. Some of them even live in the Antarctic soils, far removed from humanity, where there's no nylon existing. So they can turn those genes on when they need them. So if that was true, then you're telling me that a gene formed for that bacteria never came into contact with over the last 70 or 40 years has this nylon even existed? So in the last 40 years, Arctic bacteria needed to evolve this thing that it's never encountered before? It doesn't even make any sense.
You know, and I don't like to straw man the evolutionists. Like, for example, population geneticists do admit that man is degenerating, and they've come up with rescue devices, of course, such as mutation count mechanisms, synergistic epistasis. I'm going to provide papers that show that these are not biologically real, and they've also been falsified, because these low impact deleterious mutations, they are accumulating in the genome, and a lot of your better proponents of evolution, you know, say Jackson, Weed, Aron, Ron, you know, they talk a lot about a trade-off, okay, in regards to beneficial mutations. But I'd like to see what your answer is to this, because Joseph, while the whole genome is degenerating, and say while a few nucleotide sites may be improving, huge numbers, it's a fact, they're being degraded. And this type of trade-off that a lot of these stronger proponents of evolution, you know, talk about, it's obviously not sustainable. And what it does is it results in a shrinking functional genome size. So if you're throwing out all this information there, Joseph, from lots of nucleotide sites based on all these mutations, even duplications are largely deleterious.
Because genes are inherited from two parents, the textbook copier should have two originals in front of them as they do the work, thereby increasing the chances that an unaltered version would carry forward. It would also need the concept of beneficial mutations, where these books might also be improved by the students copying them. These improved copies would be even more favored to hand over to the new students than the originals.
Yeah, I would say natural selection is just a fancy way of saying, you know, differential reproduction, you know, who's reproducing the most. But I wrote a few things down on what you said here. So, for example, you said beneficial mutations are rare and the genome is constantly degrading. And we see entropic degeneration on a genomic level. So I agree with that. But I think it's pretty obvious that due to the rarity of say beneficial mutations that are actually not deleterious to some extent, those beneficial mutations are not going to compensate for, as I said, I think it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain of information. Those beneficial mutations are not going to compensate for the net loss of information. And natural selection, because you talked about traits, you know, natural selection, it's a fine-tuning mechanism. You know, it keeps the species as good as it can be. So I don't disagree with that. So we do agree on that, but it's severely constrained by, you know, what's called selection interference. And just to go into that a little bit, you know, selecting for one trait, as you talked about, interferes with selecting for another trait. And when you have billions of traits, Taylor, you know, segregating in the population, then the selection process actually starts to work against itself. And what that means at the end of the day is that you end up with being able to only select the best and worst mutations, as I talked about earlier. So I think evolutionists, I think you're guilty of this right now. They assume, based on universal common ancestry, right, it's got to be true type thing. So they're assuming that these mutations, they're going to have a net neutral effect. But we know that's wrong based on this selection interference. And I think, just to put it in a nutshell on everything that you said there, and I wrote down, the problem is that, you know, we know that beneficial mutations are very rare, which we agree on, so that's good. And non-neutral mutations are consistently deleterious, as we should actually expect, you know, with typographical errors in a text. So I think increasing fitness is going to be very difficult. And very much problematic. And you talked about, you know, beneficial mutations, say in bacteria, or just beneficial mutations in general. The problem that I have, though, Taylor, is that, you know, the best beneficial mutations, they're mostly reductive. Let's take sickle cell anemia, for example. It's got a significant impact. What it is, it's a broken gene, broken protein, and in the long run, it's not really taking things forward, and it's not really addressing the issue of net gain
Broken is relative. It just doesn't work the way that you want it to, maybe for oxygenation, but it has other beneficial effects.
So you're saying it's okay. So you're saying it's deleterious in one way, but it's beneficial in another. But I'm saying it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain. So how are you going to compensate for the information loss based on, a couple rare beneficial mutations? Because if you're throwing out a ton of information, and you're seeing erosion of information, erosion of nucleotides, how are you going to compensate for the actual information loss? Because a couple of rare beneficials are not going to counterbalance the accumulating damage. So with me, under the assumption of death, decay, degeneration, that's consistent. But to take your fish to fisherman or your bacteria to biologist and build a genome, I don't know how you're going to build a genome by degrading information.
While it's true that mutations can sometimes create new traits, they generally only work to destroy existing traits and information. So when a new trait called sickle cell anemia arose in Africa, it allowed people to survive malarial infections. It was a new trait, but the hemoglobin gene was broken in the process. Likewise, many examples of antibiotic resistance in bacteria deal with broken genes for transporting things into the cell. The reason that the bacteria can live is because the transporter gene is broken, the poison can't get in. It's easier to break something than to create something new. Natural selection plus mutation actually works in the wrong direction for evolution.
There's no such thing as an objectively good mutation or an objectively bad mutation.
To even think that there are 96,000 deleterious mutations building up in the human genome every 4 years, which cause cancer and all types of health issues, is not objectively bad is insane.
You can sequence the genomes. You can look at the various types of mutations, deletions, point mutations, inversion mutations, frame shift mutations. They're all reductive. You can sequence the genome, see what's being, obviously see what type of loss is being observed there. You can look at variation within the genome. You could look at decreases of heterozygosity to homozygosity. There's lots of different ways to measure the information loss. Everybody knows beneficial mutations are rare. Near neutral deleterious mutations are pouring in faster than they can be removed. You can calculate the fact that we inherit 100 new mutations per person per generation from our grandparents. I mean, there's 1,000 different ways that you can measure the information loss. And the thing is, when something's broken, so for example, sickle cell anemia, if it's due to a broken protein, broken cell, broken gene, I mean, broken indicates that it's a loss of some type. I mean, are you disagreeing with the fact that a lot of these adaptive degenerative mutations are a loss of information? Is this just an evolutionary tactic to avoid the obvious data?
I have no idea, to be honest, but I would also like you, since you're making the claim that they're rare, but how rare is rare when it comes to beneficial mutations?
Well, the thing is, you're gonna have to compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. So can you give me one or two beneficial mutations that are not reductive, that are not due to a loss of information of any kind? Because I even know the big ones that I've talked to people like Jackson Weed a bunch of times. They bring up things like melano mutation, examples of adaptive immunity, nylon digestion by bacteria. I mean, these are all based on a loss of, say, specificity, a loss of information. You can read this all in the literature.
Positive mutations that we've observed. If you prefer examples among humans, in a small community in Italy, a mutant version of the apolipoprotein AI proliferated that is more effective at removing cholesterol, giving carriers of the gene significantly lower risk for heart attack and stroke. This mutated protein is being researched as a possible future treatment. While mutations to lipoprotein receptor protein 5 can cause osteoporosis, one mutation can significantly amplify bone density and strength. The real-world carriers of this gene were the inspiration for the film Unbreakable.
When you hear about people saying there's such thing as beneficial mutations and we need them and that's how we evolved, and they bring up the lactose mutation and the increase in bone density and the HIV-1 immunity and then the L. Milano, these are all epigenetic regulations. These are not mutations. And so now that we've been unraveling the sequences of epigenetics for the last 6 years really, really well, they've actually completely eradicated the beneficial mutation theory. So basically what I want to do is get into the problems that people are having with the concept. And that would be, kind of explaining epigenetics. So basically, epigenetic inheritance is this new unconventional way of looking at genetics. Up until now, mutations were considered the only thing that could be either positive or negative in regards to fitness, because without mutations, evolution can't occur. So this is where epigenetic comes from, and it goes against basically the idea that inheritance only happens through genetic mutations, or the DNA code passes on to the parent from offspring. This means that a parent's experiences in the form of epigenetic tags can be passed down to future generations. So circadian rhythm, diet, stress, environment, all of these switches, for example, like rats, they took rats and they put them in an aquarium and they switched the lights on for 3 hours and off for 3 hours. And they kept doing this for years. And eventually those rats adapted to this light cycle. So when they had offspring, those children now would fall asleep every 3 hours and every 3 hours, just like the parents were doing, even if the lights were not being turned on or off for every 3 hours. Sometimes it was inherited, other times it was not. And then after a couple generations of lights being back to 24 hours, the rats just essentially gave up on that and they went back to being a 24-hour cycle. So it wasn't a permanent thing. It wasn't a mutation that caused this. So epigenetics is the study of where factors influence a gene and how and when the gene is expressed. Regarding like the Sherpas of the high altitude people of the Nepal, the mainstream thought is that a single 1-point mutation led to a better adaptation for the high altitudes of the Tibetan people. But modern science has revealed that the epigenetic mechanisms are also behind this adaptation. It's not a beneficial mutation. You can read a peer-reviewed paper on this, on the epigenetic signatures of the high altitude adaptation of the Tibetan population. So basically, these epigenetic regulators affect how individuals develop. This is pretty much which are causes of changes in the expression of the genes or action of a gene, or any gene, for example. We have longevity genes in us, for example. They're called the FOXO genes, and they're 7 sirtuin genes, and these are mediated by epigenetics. They're not mutations. They're turned on and off. Like for fasting, for example, turns off a mTOR and it activates these longevity genes. We want that to happen, and until we can go in and mutate these genes and constantly leave them on, we have to rely on epigenetics to do that, and we are in control of these genes by what we do. If you think about it like twins, twins have identical DNA, and think about it like one person turns 50 years old and so does the other one, right? But one will have cancer or heart disease, the other might not. One will go bald or be bipolar or start to lose their eyesight where the other doesn't. This is because of epigenetics. It's not inherited genetic mutations like we're told. Take, for example, the epigenome, which keeps a long life communication between environment and our genes that turn on and off tumor suppressing proteins. This is a reason why one twin will get cancer and the other will not, because epigenetic changes via the individual diet or environment it'll cause this. So when you hear about beneficial genetic mutations, you are actually hearing about epigenetic regulation, not beneficial mutations. This is why the Sherpa people who have been called beneficial mutations that allow them to thrive at this high altitude, yet when they relocate and have children, they pass on none of these beneficial mutations, so-called, for these high altitudes, because they have no genetic requirement for living at such altitudes. So again, it was never a beneficial mutation. It was already present in the gene that got switched on. Evidence is now shown that it's nurture over nature. So to make matters worse for evolutionary theory, epigenetic modifications themselves are actually often resulted in DNA errors. And this leads to gradual but inevitable DNA degradation as well. So epigenetic adaptation will never result in any kind of evolution, because epigenetic mechanisms only regulate pre-existing biological information. Since epigenetics is not mutation-based, and there is no actual proof for beneficial mutations anymore, of all these things that we're talking about, like the lactose mutation. They claim that it was a single SNP, a single point mutation, resulting in lactose persistence, but that's wrong. It's epigenetics like all the rest. It's actually a methylation level, MCM6 and LCT genes. So the more they look into the epigenetics, the more that they find that it's that relation and it's not a mutation at all.
The idea of forward or backward implies that evolution has some kind of directionality for it. It does not.
Evolution is not random, and it directly states that it is in a linear progression into all life that we observe today from a single cell, bacteria-like species. mutation rates. The mutation rate per generation is an observable fact. This is not open for debate. In humans, the rate is anywhere between 63.2 and 238 new mutations per generation. The factors that make the largest impact on mutation inheritance are the age of the parents. The older the parents, the more mutations get passed down to offspring. The mutation rate of 63 comes from a Greenland trio study of 78 Icelandic parents. They discovered that parental mutations are doubling every 16.5 years, meaning that if you wait till you're 36 before you have your first child, you will have accumulated double the mutations from when you were 20, which have the potential to be passed on to your offspring. This occurs because 3/4 of the human germline mutation are paternal in origin, and their total number increases with a father's age at conception. Regardless, the clock is constant and consistent. Thus, it becomes a great tool for making testable and falsifiable predictions with, and this is exactly what young Earth creationist Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has done. He has multiple mitochondrial DNA rate predictions, all of which have been validated. It is logical to conclude then that going back in time, in reverse, you end at a point where there are no mutations. 0, which begins with biblical Adam and Eve. And guess what? The first study results ever done in 1997 confirmed this, and they obtained a time of 6,500 years ago for mitochondrial Eve, using the observable rates. That's only 327 generations ago, and this was secular scientists that discovered this, not creationists. Then, using creationist methods, we assumed that Adam and Eve lived around 300 generations ago. If this was true, then using 63.2 mutations per generation, the lowest end of the spectrum for evolutionary benefits, the average human then should have 18,000 mutations built up, if this was correct. Well, guess what? Results confirmed 18,900 mutations on average, confirming Y chromosome Adam could not have lived more than 345 generations ago. So again, this compounding mutation rate is not a guess, it's a fact. This is obvious to anyone who studies biology because this is exactly how they create molecular clocks in the first place. So to think mutations are not compounding in all life is just nonsensical and flat out wrong. The inherited mutation accumulation happens to every species on Earth, and it's how we create these clocks. We are able to see the inherited mutational load per generation accumulating in all species we have ever tested. The fact of the matter is, those species may have different rates by which these clocks tick, based on a variety of factors like lifespan, reproduction age, etc. All of the results undermine the evolutionary timeline and theory of old age, as all of the observational rates are an order of magnitude higher than their assumption-based phylogenetic methods. Some are even up to 100 times faster. So, when we count up these de novo germline mutations, the numbers do not look good for evolution in any way. Not only this, many people still are under the impression that these de novo mutations are neutral and have no effect on the system whatsoever, but they couldn't be more wrong. They just don't get noticed by the system, so they are not selected for and removed. Thus, they build up, and we are able to make these clocks. But when you investigate many of these de novo mutations, they cause disease. So they are not neutral. They are near neutral, having small, slightly deleterious effects that the body cannot remove them because it cannot see them. And this is the problem for humans and all life on Earth that we have to deal with. So standing for truth then. Why go with genetic entropy since Kondratiev said that they'll go extinct in 100 generations?
Well, what Kondrashov said was, why are we not extinct 100 times over? Well, what's funny is that quote, because Kondrashov is an evolutionist. So he's asking and he's a population geneticist. That's why I always say population geneticists, evolutionary population geneticists agree that man is degenerating. And they say things like Kondrashov said, why are we not dead 100? Why are we not extinct 100 times over? That proves that the genome is young, and he can't, and all other population geneticists, they can't question their basic assumption of pond scum to people evolution, because they have to force fit all evidence, all data into that primary assumption. They're not going to question the theory, but we can look back and say, why are we not extinct 100 times over? That's because the genome is young. We haven't had enough time. That's why when you look at certain, deep lineage animals in the fossil record, and yet they remain unchanged, you see stasis. But based on what we know about genetics, based on what we know about genome degradation, that can't be possible. So, Joseph was talking about the fossil record, but the fossil record itself proves creation. Look at the coelacanth. I mean, millions and millions and millions of years ago, evolutionists say it went extinct. And all of a sudden, it pops up in the oceans today, just swimming around, never seen in the fossil record past a certain layer. Living fossils. There's a certain tree, Wollemi tree. I can't remember the exact name. I think that's what it is. Evolutionists said this is like finding a living dinosaur. And yet there it was, just hidden in plain sight. And it's funny because a tree can't run and hide like a living dinosaur could. Say, in the Congos with Mokele Medbe and stuff. We were having that debate the other day with RJ Downer. They can go hidden, yet this pine tree or this tree, Wollemi pine, went undetected all this time, and yet there it is, another living fossil. So, like I said, everything points to genetic degeneration and a biblical creation model. So I appreciate the question.
As we've mentioned on this channel before, the hallmark of a good theory is its ability to make predictions.
I'm guessing he'll just ignore the massive amounts of failed predictions in this video.
A hypothesis must have predictions, must be accurate in explaining the world around us. Okay, let's look at the Bible, for example. The Bible tells us clearly that it is the history book of the universe. And yet, why is the known genetic data so absolutely consistent with a biblical-based model? It's really far too close for comfort for the evolutionists. We've made future testable predictions. For example, on mutation rates, we've made testable predictions on mutation rates in the Khoisan peoples, on DNA function. We've made flood geology related predictions, prediction after prediction. When we actually look at the genetic data, for example, let's make some retrodictions. Let's see if the Bible really is the history book of the universe. Biblical Adam and Eve predictions, for example. Well, you'd predict low genetic diversity. You'd predict one Y male ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA female ancestor, the fact that most genes come in two versions. If Eve was taken from Adam, Noah's flood predictions, for example, you'd predict that all people should be closely related. There's only a few mitochondrial DNA lines, the 1Y chromosome line, evidence of rapid population growth. And at the end of the day, we actually see, based on the three main events in Scripture, specifically in Genesis, we can actually address these with modern genetics. These events, for example, the creation of Adam and Eve, the flood of Noah, the Tower of Babel. Let's look at the data. We now know that all human beings are actually profoundly similar genetically, and this points directly to Adam and Eve. If you only started with two people, that restricts the diversity today. Over deep time, any large population, of course, I hope Jackson understands this, will most certainly and undoubtedly accumulate enormous numbers of mutations, resulting in enormous amounts of genetic diversity. This is a serious problem for evolutionary theory because it is now absolutely clear that mankind has very limited genetic variation. While the observed low genetic diversity is a massive problem, of course, from the evolutionary perspective, the perspective and the fairy tale that Jackson here is pushing, this is most certainly expected and predicted, as I've said, from the biblical perspective. From the biblical model, we all come from just two people. This obviously means that limited diversity is easy to explain. The Bible predicted this. This means the death and demise of the evolutionary bottleneck theory and the evolutionary out of Africa theory. Now, what they're going to say, they're going to resort to a near extinction event in order to reduce homogeneity, but it would cause permanent and severe genetic damage. For example, enormous numbers of deleterious mutations will undoubtedly go to fixation. But based on this low genetic diversity, based on the fact that every single human being in the world is very similar, they have to resort to what they do best, a rescue device. Jackson Weed here presents some predictions. Why doesn't he talk about all the failed predictions, all the inconsistencies, all the contradictory evidence? They cherry pick selective and preferential treatment of data, of course. This apparent bottleneck, this near extinction event, it is just that. It is a rescue device. How could such a tiny, nearly extinct, genetically compromised population suddenly explode into all parts of the planet and seizing dominion over the world? Because this hypothetical, it's all storytelling, it's all hypotheses, unsupported hypotheses. And this apparent evolutionary bottleneck, although it might have been able to reduce overall human diversity, which is what they're trying to do to explain the data, you must understand, and Jackson here talks about post hoc explanations, rationalizations. Well, this is just a post hoc embellishment to the evolutionary fairy tale. It is not actually credible at all, because, as I hope he understands, small bottleneck populations have extreme problems. For example, there are approximately 10,000 cheetahs in the world today. Look it up. And conservationists, people who are worried about this, they acknowledge that the cheetah is already showing serious signs of inbreeding and genetic decline. Genetic diversity has eroded, of course, based on inbreeding. The evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that they pull to explain this data, but the Bible already predicted it thousands of years ago, involving this extended near extinction event, which is obviously associated with severe inbreeding, as I've demonstrated here, it's not even remotely plausible or feasible. So from the evolutionary perspective, human genetic homogeneity still remains, regardless of what they want to tell you, regardless of the rescue device and story that they pull, remains a very serious theoretical problem. But according to us, according to the biblical based model and biblical perspective, there is absolutely no problem with a relatively homogeneous human population. We start with just two people, of course, and this population bottleneck, according to the Bible, is benign. And then 10 generations later, we see a second single generation bottleneck of just 8 people occurred at the time of Noah. And both bottlenecks, of course, read Genesis. Look at the data. They were both very brief and then followed by explosive growth. And in both of these cases, there would have been almost no previously accumulated mutations. We see the accumulation of low impact, near neutral deleterious mutations. We see genetic entropy. Take that back to a point of least genetic entropy. That would be a point of creation. At this point, there wouldn't be that accumulation of mutations and hence no inbreeding effects, of course. I can't believe evolutionists still bring up that objection. It's a straw man. So very limited human genetic diversity is a massive, it's pretty much a fatal problem for evolutionary theory, and it leads to unrestrained storytelling. That's what they do. The evolution story needs to be revised almost annually. Yet limited human genetic diversity is very obviously compatible with the biblical perspective and does not actually require any far-fetched mental inventions. And I mean, we can go on and on and on about these predictions. We can go on and on and on. I mean, For example, let's look at Noah's flood. This story tells us that all people should be closely related. It tells us there should be only a few mitochondrial DNA lines as Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives, and only one Y chromosome since it's only Noah. His 3 sons would have inherited his Y chromosome. And we should have significant evidence of rapid population growth. And it turns out this too is exactly what we find in modern genetics. Guess what? This did not all have to be true. The Tower of Babel account, for example. We have found a single dispersal of all people in the relatively recent past who traveled in these small little people groups into uninhabited territory through the Middle East. Too close for comfort for evolutionists. They call it the Out of Africa story. As I've shown and demonstrated, that's dead. But these are all biblical based predictions.
We've talked a lot on this channel about how evolution is used to understand the past, but today we're going to talk about how evolution can be used to predict the future. If the evolution of all organisms from a set of common ancestors is true, then we should be able to test that. An example of a modern prediction of evolution is one we have discussed at length, the chromosome 2 fusion, including all its details. Using these frequencies, we can generate a graph like this, showing the signature of mutations. If mutations were also the cause of interspecies genetic differences, then we would predict a similar spectrum graph when counting up the different types of nucleotide differences between humans and chimps. And we do. This makes no sense under a non-evolutionary model. Under creationism, it implies that a creator created interspecies DNA differences that just so happen to look exactly as though they had occurred by the same natural processes that give rise to within-species differences. It also makes no sense under a non-evolutionary model why genetic sequences for homologous proteins converge the further you go back in time, which was, by the way, also predicted under evolution.
Jackson Weed here uses a lot of arguments that assumes the majority of our genome is actually non-functional or simply based on evolutionary leftovers. Evolutionists like Jackson here, they assume that all DNA differences are the result of mutations over time, of course, and based on our model of pre-existing functional heterozygosity, we would actually assume and predict that the majority of our genome is created diversity, that God encoded these functional DNA differences from the start. And what's funny is we now know that the junk DNA era has been completely overturned. For example, this human chromosomal 2 fusion that Jackson here says arose through a fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes, that alleged fusion, that alleged site where the fusion supposedly took place actually represents a highly organized functional gene. And as you can see, there's significant lack of evidence for a cryptic centromere site. And we're going to get more into these various arguments that he uses on endogenous retroviruses, specific pseudogenes, things that assume evolutionary leftovers, and we're going to get more into that. But in regards to the chromosome 2 fusion, he fails to mention that Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins wrote a extensive technical paper in February the 8th, 2017 titled Debunking the Debunkers. It's a response to criticism and regarding the refutation of the human chromosome 2 fusion paper that he originally put out back in 2013. And in this paper, you can read for yourself. You see a ton of genomic data after data, evidence after evidence that clearly shows that the alleged fusion site really is a promoter in this DDX11L2 gene, and that the activity, contrary to Jackson Weed and other evolutionists that have attempted to rebut this incoming evidence, is neither nominal or spurious. And there's so much data in this paper and coming about that you can read that shows that the alleged cryptic centromere site has actually no homologous chromosomal matches in the chimpanzee genome. And I quote word for word here from this paper titled Debunking the Debunkers, that it is also shown the site is too small to represent a centromere, and that interstitial alphoid repeat regions are common on many human chromosomes, including chromosome 2 that has 6 different alphoid-rich repeat regions, outside the centromere. However, the most negating evidence against the cryptic centromere site is that it is completely situated inside the actively expressed protein coding gene. In fact, Dr. Tompkins says in this paper, sections of it extend across both intron and exon regions according to a line transcript, and the alleged cryptic centromere is clearly a functional part of a protein coding gene and not the remnant of a centromere. Now, according to the pre-existing heterozygosity model, the created heterozygosity model, we would predict that the vast majority of our genome is functional, of course, and Jackson here uses some of these shared genetic mistakes, these pseudogenes, to prove evolution. For example, the broken remnants of an egg yolk gene. And these pseudogenes are now known to be functional DNA elements and not actually mistakes. The junk DNA era, the junk DNA paradigm, it is dead. It's been overturned, and the fact is we understand very little of the DNA language. We're dealing with a very foreign language here, and we've only just begun to discover and uncover just how functional the human genome really is. It's mind-boggling how many experiments would actually be necessary to conclude with any amount of confidence that a certain set of DNA sequences has absolutely no function at all. And there's preliminary biochemical evidence for function. It doesn't just exist for the known function, the known functional pseudogenes, as I pointed out, but also for at least 80% of all the pseudogenes in humans, for example. And given all the data that we know, the evidence that we know, it's obvious that the other 20% may still yet to be discovered to be functional in some human tissue, or even under some physiological condition that has yet been studied extensively. I mean, many non-coding RNA genes, such as these pseudogenes, they're only expressed under certain conditions. So the fact that he uses a lot of this evidence that assumes mutations are the source of all variety, that assumes that the majority of our genome is junk, and a lot of them will say, oh, we never predicted junk, but you can talk to scientists. I've debated scientists, evolutionists. They say that the genome can be no more than 20% functional. Well, we're predicting that the vast majority of our genome is functional, and that's exactly what we're seeing, because the scientists, the findings, the influx of scientific papers are finding that numerous of these so-called fossil sequences, they're not pseudo after all, and these genes are absolutely necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. You can look at some that have been overturned. For example, the beta globin pseudogene, that has been completely overturned. The evolutionists used to say that this pseudogene is just a useless genomic fossil, according to their own evolutionary predictions. But this gene, we now know, is a highly functional, and conveniently, it's an integrated feature of the human genome, and it's actually essential. This supposed broken remnant of a ancient egg yolk gene or chicken gene, there's no evidence for this remnant, that it even exists, and it's instead this fragment appears to be a functional DNA element. Junk DNA era, it's dead. I mean, they'll say the gene order along chromosomes has no function, and apparently and consequently this shared gene order demonstrates common ancestry, but the gene order along chromosomes does indeed perform a function. Apparently, Jackson Weed here will say that, humans are genetically closer to apes than to other, say, animal species, for example, using whatever type of gene sequencing, whatever type of phylogenetic analysis. And he says that it demonstrates common ancestry, but these relative hierarchies, they're actually characteristic of design, because our model does actually predict design. Of course, if nested hierarchies The classification of life, for example, can be compared to classification of modes of transportation on how different companies manufacture cars based on their similarities, forming these hierarchies. Humans, pigs, rats, and ducks, they're all land-dwelling. Even though they are separate kinds according to our model, since they are all land-dwelling, they can share similar nested hierarchies or design. It doesn't take much reflection at all to see how this model, the biblical creation model, the young earth creation model, predicts relative genetic hierarchies. And these are actually found in nature. For example, the God of the Bible, the one we are arguing for, he of course designed the entire universe, and this would actually consist of all the various kinds of biological life that actually live in it. We would then expect and predict to find that this life that God created fits a design pattern. So of course, if we as humans, according to the Bible, God created us in his image, we should be able to get a clear idea for what kinds of design patterns our creator God might have used. And we can get a sense for this and an idea for this by looking and studying and examining the patterns that actually result from human designs. And what we actually see is that means of transportation, they naturally fall into this Linnaean style categories. And Jackson Wheat here, he uses examples of transitional forms, but as we know, many products of human design also evidently span two very different categories. I hope even he can agree with me that boats and tanks fall into entirely different classes. And Dr. Stefan Frello used a lot of this evidence as well. I debated him, and I would recommend going to watch it and seeing thorough refutations of these same tired arguments. But boats and tanks, they fall into two entirely different classes, yet there exist vehicles that actually blend the features of both these two extremely dissimilar means of transportation. Let's look at an amphibious assault vehicle, for example. This is resistant to classification. This would be the perfect example, according to the evolutionists, of a transitional form. But yet, what do we know? This vehicle is designed for the transitional environments between water and land. Basic rules of, say, efficiency and function, we predict function, will most certainly result in similar stages of manufacturing. If you want to look at nested hierarchies in DNA, well, it's obvious that we would find shared elements located in the blueprints of different manufacturing companies, say from across the entire planet. Let's take Toyota, let's take Chrysler, let's take Mercedes-Benz or BMW. Evidently, if the end products have similarities, the blueprints, of course, by necessity, have them as well. DNA hierarchies also fit the model of created heterozygosity and the model of biblical creation. So means of transportation, of course, they naturally fall and can be grouped into a hierarchical classification scheme. Like I said, these nested hierarchies, they're agnostic to the question of creation and evolution, as there exists competing explanation. And just to put it into perspective, I hope we can recognize and identify cars. Cars are obvious to anybody, even to a 5-year-old. And even though I hope we can agree every car is unique, all cars do evidently share a set of features. For example, a certain range of height from the ground, 4 doors, 4 wheels, lack of a cab bed, among more. Now, if we shrink the list of features, we can now bring in SUVs and trucks into this same group. I'm sure you can see exactly where I'm going with this. Trucks, as we know, are higher off the ground than cars, and since most trucks consist of a cab bed, the number of features shared among cars and trucks is less than those shared among just cars. And we can go on and on and on. We can then bring in motorcycles and so on. Technically, the more vehicles that we actually group and throw into our transportation classification system, the smaller the list of shared features becomes. And this is exactly like the Linnaean classification system. I mean, I hope we can all see that at some point the list of shared features among modes of transportation, as I am talking about here, becomes very, very small. Just think about bringing in and including boats and planes with land vehicles, for example. I mean, we don't even have wheels on the list at this point. This hierarchical pattern of life strongly suggests deliberate and intentional design. But as I've said before, we predict function. We look to function. And evolutionists themselves, they can make specific predictions on DNA function as we have done. But they haven't. And the trajectory strongly favors genome-wide functionality and the biblical creation model.
Cancer is a disease of genetic mutation, and it's these changes in the DNA sequence that really affect the behavior of a cell and then can lead to tumor formation. And so what we wanted to do in this project was really try to understand all of the genetic mutations that are driving pancreas cancer by looking at regions of the genome that most people tend to ignore. And so when you think of the human genome, you can liken it to a Broadway production where you have genes, and the proteins that they encode are the actors, the ones that we all really focus on. But it's important to remember that there are people backstage, the producers, directors, stage hands, costume designers, who are critically important for making sure that the actors are on the stage when they should be, saying the right lines and singing the right songs. And so while most sequencing studies really focused on the genes, we really wanted to focus on the accessory regions of the DNA, the regulatory elements that tell genes when to turn on and when to turn off, really the stage hands of the genome. And so what we did is we developed a new algorithm in collaboration with Tyler Garvin and Mike Schatz here at Cold Spring Harbor and other scientists around the world called GECKO. And what this algorithm does is it looks through the genome and looks through all the mutations that people have in cancer and tries to really pinpoint those in those regulatory regions that are going to have a really great impact on the expression of genes that might be driving tumorigenesis. And so we found really a number of really exciting things when we wanted to apply GECKO to pancreas cancer. So first, we found these mutations in these regulatory regions do exist, and we could experimentally validate them back in the lab. Secondly, what we were able to find was a new prognostic marker that might tell patients more about their outcome when they are diagnosed with the disease. And then finally, we found patterns of these mutations suggesting that they're being acted on during tumor evolution near certain genes and near certain pathways that are critically important for cancer progression. And the implications of this is it really argues for whole genome sequencing of cancer, not just looking at the genes, but looking at the regions around the genes in the genome that tell the genes what to do to really give us a more full understanding of the genetics of disease.
Now, the other part of this that we want to talk about is something called chromosome fusion. Now, I want to tell you a few facts, and then I'm going to tell you the evolutionary story to account for these facts. So, it is a fact that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and it is a fact that chimps have 24. Okay, so there's a difference. Now, if we came from a common ancestor, why do we have 23 and chimps have 24? They have to account for that somehow. Now, when they did initial studies of human DNA, this is before sequencing was really common and really quick, they would stain the DNA, the chromosomes, and they could see what are called banding patterns. And they noticed the human chromosome 2 was very similar to chimp chromosomes 12 and 13. And so just to show you that, so this is the real staining here, okay, the real chromosomes, and then they show it to you in a figure form. So human chromosome 2, they said, it's very similar to these two chromosomes, 12 and 13. All right, so they developed a story based off of that, and that story was, well, there must have been a fusion that occurred in the line leading to humans of two of those chromosomes, such so that we have 23 and chimps have 24. So here's how the story goes. In a common ancestor, there were 24 pairs of chromosomes. After they diverged, okay, so humans are going down this path to become humans, chimps are going down this path to become chimps, there was a fusion in the human line. Okay, two chromosomes fused together, so therefore humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and since all humans come from them, all humans have 23. In the chimp line, that fusion did not occur. So just like the ancestor, they have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Since all chimps come from them, they have 24, all chimps have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Now, this is not based on any evidential experience. This is just a story that they had to develop to explain this. It's not like you can go in the fossils and find this, okay? That's not reality. So this is just the story they've developed to explain it. And they would even go so far, some of them, as to say it is definitive proof that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor. Now, here's the thing. In science, we don't use the term definitive proof. If you're going to use that, it's called a law. And, you know, you need to have a lot of things backing that up, backing that statement up, because that is a very strong statement. And I want to share with you just some quotes from a few theistic evolutionists, again, professing Christians, but they believe in evolution in millions of years to kind of show that. The first is from Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. He said, the fusion that occurred as we evolved from the apes has left its DNA imprint here. It is very difficult to understand this observation without postulating a common ancestor. He said, how is it that human chromosome 2 looks so similar to chimps chromosomes 12 and 13 unless there was a fusion that occurred? I mean, how else can you explain that, is basically what he's saying. This next quote comes from Ken Miller, and he's a molecular biologist and theistic evolutionist, and he said, you know what? If we don't find a fused chromosome in humans, evolution is wrong. We don't share a common ancestor. Whoa. Okay, so you're willing to bet it all on one piece of evidence. And so, and what's interesting is this quote comes from a YouTube video that someone posted of his lecture, and they labeled it "How to Shut Up Pesky Creationists." It has been viewed nearly 2 million times. Okay, so this is a very common thing that people will use to, so to speak, to say that, you know, we're wrong, chimps and humans definitely had a common ancestor. Now, although he says this, and he's made this statement actually several times, that he'd be willing to change his mind, basically, if it could be shown otherwise, I don't believe it. Because I can show that human chromosome 2 is not the result of a fusion. He has been presented with that evidence, and he has not changed his mind. Why? Because this isn't about the evidence. Okay, the evidence is clear. It's about a worldview, and not wanting to change that worldview, even in spite of the obvious, okay, wanting to cling to that. So let me summarize here what their supposed proof of evolution is. So they, or that we shared a common ancestor with the apes. So again, chromosomes 12 and 13 were in the ancestor, okay, and in the line leading to humans, a fusion occurred, and so now we have one that's known as chromosome 2 in human. This has gone so far, so to speak, that in chimps, they don't have chromosomes 12 and 13 anymore. They relabeled them 2A and 2B to represent the fact that they think it's a fusion that occurred in the human line. That's how strong this belief is. Now, if a fusion had occurred, what would we expect to see? There should be telltale signs of that. So you see these little dark blue caps on the ends of the chromosomes. Those are called telomeres. They're certain sequences of DNA. It kind of repeats itself over and over again. They serve as end caps to kind of protect the DNA. And interestingly enough, one of their jobs is to prevent fusion. So I'm kind of struggling how they were involved in a fusion when that's one of their jobs, is to prevent it. So we should see a bunch of telomere sequences right there. The other thing is this little red symbolic square here, that's a centromere. Every chromosome has one centromere, and it's important when the cells are dividing and the DNA material needs to be divided up between the two cells. There are certain sequences associated with those. So we should see one in the fused chromosome. It's not active anymore, but it should be there along with the real one. So that's what we should see. So we can sequence human chromosome 2, and we can look for those things, and that's what they've done. And so what did they find? Well, they're having trouble finding a lot of those telomeres in the middle. There's some sequences there that are sort of kind of like telomeres, but not nearly in the number they should be, okay, if they're truly telomeres. So that's a problem, okay? The telomere sequences, even the evolutionists would admit that it's very, very degenerate. And they kind of scratch their heads like, well, why is it so degenerate? Why aren't there more telomere sequences here? Because it's not a fusion. That's why. There shouldn't be any telomeres there because it's not two chromosomes that have fused together. Then they looked for that centromere, that other centromere that should be there, and they can't really find it. There's some sequences there that sometimes are associated with centromeres, but they're certainly not unique to centromeres. We find them in other places. So that's a problem as well. That other inactivated centromere isn't there. Now, there's many other lines of evidence that Dr. Tompkins has developed to show that it's just doesn't look like a fused chromosome. It doesn't match up with chromosomes 12 and 13. And one of them that he found, and he's published on this, and you'll see the reference in the next slide, is he found a gene there, okay, that spans the fusion site. Genes are always found on just one chromosome. I mean, it's not part of the genes here on this chromosome and part of the genes over here on this chromosome, okay? That doesn't happen. The gene's always on one chromosome. So how could it be that you somehow had parts of it on both and then they fused together and now those parts are together? That's just not realistic. So here's the supposed fusion site and here's the gene, right? Part of it's on one side and part of it's on the other side. The other thing is telomeres don't occur in the middle of genes. I mean, genes aren't around telomeres. So it's just filled with a lot of problems. And the conclusion is the human chromosome 2 is not the result of a fusion. It just doesn't match up sequence-wise with chimp chromosomes 12 and 13. So therefore, it cannot support common ancestry for humans and chimps.
Jackson Weed assumes that humans and chimpanzees are related through common ancestry at all, but at the end of the day, this data here, I'll just present just a few forms of evidence that completely destroy the idea that humans and chimpanzees are actually related through common ancestry. They'll say human, chimpanzee are genetically identical by 98 to 99%. And yet we now know that this is based tremendously off of preferential and selective treatment of data. In other words, cherry-picked data. What they're using is they're using sequences that they actually expect to be similar. They don't include non-aligned DNA, gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. So sure, based on cherry-picked data and selective treatment of data, they might be able to get 98 to 99% similarity. When you actually include and acknowledge it all, such as these gaps or these copy number variations, this non-aligned DNA, then what you actually get is something more like 88% or even lower. And at the end of the day, that's over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the two species. And most or nearly all the secular research reports on this human-chimp DNA similarity omit significant amounts of data that do not align with each other. And there's significant DNA sequence discontinuity between the two genomes. That evolution, bacteria to biologists, evolution cannot explain or even account for. At the end of the day, the reality is that humans are not apes, and they were actually created separately and uniquely in the image of God. And not only does the Bible prove this, but so does DNA evidence. We can look to the Y chromosome. This is just icing on the cake at this point, because Y chromosome DNA destroys human evolution. The extensively and remarkably different DNA sequence of the Y chromosomes between human and chimp presents a very, very serious and detrimental problem. It's destructive. It's actually a fatal blow for common ancestry, because given the extremely low level of recombination and DNA sequence diversity on the Y chromosome, the human evolution paradigm encounters a fatal blow, as I've said, and a very serious problem. This problem is that the human and chimp Y chromosomes should be considerably more similar to each other. If human evolution was true, they should be the most similar chromosomes in the genome because they are so stable In other words, there's a small amount of variation. And why is this the case? Especially when we know that every single human being on the planet is extremely similar genetically. 0.5% difference max, I believe it is. And all male Y chromosomes on the planet almost identical, but yet chimp to human Y chromosome 70% dissimilar. There's just so much evidence that destroys this idea of human to chimp ancestry. More icing on the cake. Let's look at orphan genes, for example. Orphan genes, they're fully functional gene sequences that code for both a functional messenger RNA and a protein, and they lack similar counterparts in other organisms. Orphan genes that are specific to humans are powerful evidence against the idea that we evolved from apes. Why is this? Well, it's because these genes appear fully formed, uniquely integrated into the complexity of the human genomic network, and clearly functional. And of course, very important to numerous cellular processes. And there's no evidence for common ancestry with apes or any other creatures. So as usual, as has been demonstrated here, in this short time, in this short video, genetics once again proves biblical creation and destroys fish to fisherman evolution. This amazing category of genes are taxonomically restricted genes that are unique, absolutely unique to each type of organism. These genes appear suddenly without any trace of ancestry in apes or any other animal. They don't fit the hypothetical fairy tale of evolutionary theory, and that's what evolutionists like Jackson Wheat here do, is they do a lot of imagining. That type of large-scale evolution only happens and occurs in the imaginations of those that actually want to believe in it. Orphan genes are evidently part of the genomic landscape that is indicative of each created kind, and the explanation of orphan genes fits the biblical model of created kinds, as does all other genetic evidence. The orphan genes are especially needed for the uniqueness associated with each created kind, as described in the book of Genesis.
Aside from genetic predictions, evolution also makes fossil predictions.
And when those predictions fail, they are not held as evidence against evolution, they're just ignored completely. Looking at the fossil record, we can see that ocean life dies in the ocean and land life dies on land. That's how it works. So we would expect to see aquatic life in deep sea layers because they were dying there far before the flood occurred. And until the flood came, which wreaked havoc on life existing at that time, causing dinosaur graveyards and things like that. Remember, when things die on land, they get eaten or degrade rather fast. The odds of life dying to make the quantity of oil that we find on Earth today is best explained by the flood. It's also safe to say that the fossil record is not valid when we find evidence of discrepancies in the record. And guess what? We do. The upside-down geologic column in Pakistan is one such place. At the foot of the Karakoram Mountains in the Salt Range Formation, scientists have discovered fossilized plants and insects. From the evolutionary perspective, these remains belong to the upper part of the geological column. However, this formation lies beneath the Cambrian rock, which is dated back to over 400 million years. Discoveries such as these support the biblical version of the Earth's history, whereby the geological column is primarily a consequence of the global flood and its aftermath. It is no surprise that there is some order to the fossil record, such as sea creatures buried beneath land creatures, and mobile creatures such as birds near the top. But, since as the Salt Range Formation testifies, the ordered charts that adorn textbooks aren't always what they find in the field. Many results today have kicked evolution hard in the dirt. They have found complete stasis in the entire Pliocene era. We also know that the Ashley phosphate beds in North Carolina have found human bones and artifacts with dinosaurs together. Also remember that they also found modern-day birds dating back in the Cambrian rock layers which supposedly evolved from dinosaurs. It's a total mess. Also consider that many of the biggest dinosaurs, such as the long-necked sauropods like the Brachiosaurus, Titanosaurus, and Apatosaurus, would have eaten colossal amounts of vegetation. So why do we not find such abundance of these plants in the rocks containing these dinosaur fossils? Take for example the Morrison Formation in Montana. Even though this formation had yielded many dinosaur fossils, they're very scarce in vegetation. This phenomenon of missing vegetation doesn't just apply to dinosaurs or their rock layers. The Coconino Sandstone in the Grand Canyon has many animal trackways, but it's almost devoid of plants. These rocks tell us something profound about Earth's history. They suggest that these deposits laid down are not ecosystems buried over eons of time. Otherwise, we'd find more evidence as plants that the animals ate. Instead, the evidence fits nicely with the biblical model of early Earth's history, whereas these animals were transported and buried catastrophically during Noah's flood. Geologists have assumed and say that calm weather conditions are required for these settling processes to occur to form mudstone. Therefore, whenever they encounter mud deposits, they interpret them as forming in tranquil water environments. However, recent research published in the prestigious Journal of Science has turned this argument on its head. The researchers showed that mud deposits form from rapidly flowing water. Yet again, evolutionary theory fails when put to the test, and we have more evidence for a global flood.
Darwin also observed that the bones inside the wings of birds looked like they were fingers that got fused together. So he predicted that a fossil of an ancient bird with separate fingers would be found one day. This ended up being Archaeopteryx.
You can find almost anything if you look in the fossil record that resembles something else. That means nothing. Paleontologist Lawrence Whitmer of Ohio University, in a commentary, stated, "Perhaps the time has come to finally accept that Archaeopteryx was just another small, feathered, bird-like theropod fluttering around in the Jurassic." What do evolutionists say about fully modern birds found in the early strata before Archaeopteryx supposedly evolved these fused fingers together? You guessed it, nothing. Stephen Jay Gould said, "It's a curious mosaic, not a transitional fossil." Even the stinkbird, alive today, is a species of tropical bird found in swamps, forests, and mangroves in the Amazon and in South America. It is notable for having chicks that possess claws. The truth? Hand claws are actually widespread in modern birds, and not all that unusual. Ornithologists say Archaeopteryx is a bird, as where paleontologists say it's a dinosaur. Not even a consensus between the sciences.
Another example of a very precise prediction concerns our yolk. However, eutherian mammals like us have a placenta that made the yolk sac obsolete.
The yolk sac is not obsolete. Think about it. If the yolk sac is a worthless remnant nowadays, like he says, then obviously it can be cut off from the human embryo because it isn't needed, right? Not at all. The yolk sac is the source of the human embryo's first blood cells and a blood nutrient supply. It's 100% required, as death would result without it. Lumen, the Boundless Anatomy and Physiology website, even tells us blood is conveyed in the walls of the sac by the primary aorta. After circulating through a wide-meshed capillary plexus, it is returned by the vitelline veins in the tubular heart of the embryo. This vitelline circulation absorbs nutrient material from the yolk sac that is conveyed to the embryo. It is true that the yolk sac of birds and reptiles contain yolk to nourish the embryo, but the placental mammal's yolk contains no yolk at all. Also, this so-called yolk sac is not a source of nourishment as it is for birds, or in a bird egg. Rather, its purpose and design is that of blood supply, proving it is not proof of evolutionary leftover remnants. To say that it's lost its primary function is intellectually dishonest. It's always had a function, and it was that of blood supply. Even Wikipedia acknowledges its importance by saying its function as the developmental circulatory system of the human embryo before internal circulation begins. Even embryologists today no longer call it a yolk sac, but umbilical vessel, because of its vital importance. This excerpt was taken from Larson's Human Embryology, 4th edition. The definitive yolk sac remains a major structure associated with the developing embryo through the 4th week and performs important early functions. Extraembryotic mesoderm forming in the outer layer of the yolk sac is a major site of hematopoiesis. Primordial germ cells can first be identified in humans in the wall of the yolk sac. Even by mistake or mutation, a human being cannot produce yolks or gills, because we don't have and never had the DNA instructions for that. It's disingenuous to say that this proves evolution. Even Study.com states it was originally thought that human yolk sac was a vestigial organ, no longer of use to the embryo. But research over the past decade or so has brought new insight into the use of the yolk sac by the embryo. Also consider ventraline circulation, the system of blood flowing from the embryo to the yolk sac and back again. This system would not even exist at all without the yolk sac. This was never a useless, leftover remnants of a yolk sac. It was never a yolk sac at all, and should never have been called one. Hence, the modern-day name change. Do you see the lengths evolutionists have to go to present any evidence to support the lie? One can only wonder why evolutionists would call the structure by the wrong name and label it a primitive, when it's absolutely necessary for the survival of the developing individual.
However, eutherian mammals like us have a placenta that made the yolk sac obsolete. Paleontologists predicted an ant fossil that had features of wasps in the Cretaceous, and that was confirmed as Sphecomyrma.
For one thing, this species was never found to ever have any wings. No Sphecomyrma hamuli was ever found around the anterior portions. As were wasps, their fore and hind leg wings are hooked together with groups with tiny little hooks called hamuli, which ants do not have. Also consider, according to evolutionists, it was believed that this evolutionary age of 79 to 92 million years ago, there had not yet been any complex social organizations of ants into colonies. However, with careful analysis of these specimens, it reveals the presence of the metapleural gland, which is only found in ants, and only those that live in colonies. These glands secrete antibiotics which prevent bacteria and fungi entering the colonies. Ants were always ants. They never transitioned into flying, nor became wasps. Not a single drop of observational or testable science proves that ants became wasps. Now that Jackson has admitted that he was wrong before, maybe this video will have him finally admit that he was wrong about genetic entropy, mutations, and selection.
Will the evolutionists ever admit to the absolute limits of natural selection and mutations?
All mutations are invisible to natural selection.
Virtually all? Are you kidding me?
Because they cause such a minute change to the organism that natural selection won't see it.
Oh my goodness. I can't believe you just... actually, I'm not surprised because everything you said has been so absolutely incorrect.
So that's a science fact, Jackson.
It's not actually... Creationism is not and has never, ever been science.
No, Jackson Wheat. Evolution, fish to fisherman, bacteria-like to biologist evolution has never been, nor ever will be, scientific. Creationists are the ones winning the war, and we are winning it in genetics. These evolutionists like to look to bones found in the dirt, but bones found in the dirt are not inherited, traits are. We are making testable predictions in the realm of genetics. We are making predictions on DNA function, mitochondrial DNA rates, mitochondrial DNA differences. There are so many predictions that the evolutionists are not even touching on. For example, predictions have been made on the most divergent of African people groups, the Khoisan peoples. Let's see if the evolutionists can match up to the creationists. They can't. This video has proven to you and proven to everybody that evolutionism has been refuted. It's been falsified. Even the best examples that Jackson Wheat can point to are just due to pre-existing genetic adaptation. All organisms have this. Jackson Wheat loves to look to the notothynioid anti-freeze Arctic fish. They entered cold water and adapted accordingly. This is not the type of change that's going to take your fish to fishermen. Changes through the breaking down of pre-existing systems or the breaking down or decay of prior and pre-existing information, epigenetic, and just general adaptive change, adaptive degeneration, all of these types of changes are not forward evolution. The best beneficial mutations that can be pointed to are destructive. They're degrading. They're not taking things forward. Evolutionists like Jackson Wheat here have failed over and over again to address the key issue, which is net gain versus net loss. Watch my debates with Jackson Wheat. I ask him to explain away. Give me an explanation for this very key issue of net gain versus net loss. And the best he's been able to come up with and that he will point to is what he refers to as a trade-off. But this trade-off is clearly not sustainable. The created heterozygosity model demands the types of changes that we actually observe. But these types of changes will not take your fish to fisherman. So in a nutshell, Jackson Wheat stating that creation has never been scientific, nor ever will be scientific, he's projecting, because it is evolution, evolutionary theory that will never be scientific. Creationists are making the predictions, and this is fact.
First of all, evolution is not random.
If you're having as much fun as I am debunking the religion of evolutionism, please subscribe, because we are just getting started. Jackson Wheat has been corrected over and over and over again. If you don't believe me, just go look at my debate on Modern Day Debate, where he gives no valid rebuttal to that of genomic degeneration, in the fact that there is no type of natural selection that can stop the degeneration process. This video is going to be quick. If you want to see a full, lengthy, detailed, and very technical debunking of all the numerous claims made by Jackson Wheat, go look at his video titled Evolutionary Predictions, and check out our video titled Evolutionary Predictions Debunked. Now, when we look to the biblical-based model, and when we look to empirical science, they are perfectly consistent. Because the biblical-based model predicts death, degeneration, and extinction. This is due to the fall. We would predict that we are going down and not up. Now, if you think of it this way, we have a genome of 3 billion letters. Now, if we were to take out one letter, or say change one letter randomly, let me ask you, is there going to be a huge fitness effect? No. The fact is, it's going to have a tiny fitness effect. It's like rust on a car, or a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. You can't see each rust event. You can't see each single spelling mistake, but it's continuous and it's destructive. Selection, which Jackson Wheat clearly does not understand, cannot stop the loss of information that is incredibly and immeasurably complex. Now, this is due to low impact mutation accumulation, and this is happening on the molecular level. Selection acts on the phenotype and not the genotype. Selection, of course, happens on the level of the entire organism. And it is absolutely evident that mutations and natural selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. That means, consequently, and unfortunately for the evolutionist, mutations and natural selection obviously cannot create genomes. Now, the facts are clear. Nearly all non-neutral mutations are deleterious. We inherit a multitude of old mutations. Please look at our video titled Mutation Rates, because we inherit approximately 100 new mutations per person per generation. Now, deleterious mutations, they're pouring in faster than can be removed. And based on what we know about the function of the genome, most mutations are not neutral. They are nearly neutral. And natural selection is constrained by selection interference. Now, Jackson Wheat obviously doesn't understand that the majority of these mutations, the fact that they're near neutral, selection cannot see them. They build up relentlessly. He can't show us any form of natural selection that can remove the accumulating mutation. The genetic load is growing. It's a fact. Anybody should be able to see that most mutations fall within a no selection zone, and that almost all of them are absolutely deleterious. Even if I gave Jackson wheat strong selection, this entire zone that I'm talking about can only undergo degeneration. Here's the bottom line, and I've told him this over and over again. The evolutionists, what they'll do, it's an evolutionary tactic, is they will commit a confirmation bias fallacy. When faced with the facts and faced with the evidence, they will turn to any type of explanation, no matter how weak or how obvious of a rescue device that it is, just to hold on to their belief in pond scum to people evolution. Now, outside of this no selection zone, the substantially bad mutations will be selected away, of course, and an occasional rare high impact beneficial will be amplified. That's the bottom line. Selection can amplify the best beneficial mutations and remove the most detrimental and deleterious mutations, but it can do nothing against the influx of near neutral deleterious mutations. These accumulate relentlessly. Now, Jackson wheat, he will look to beneficial mutations. And even if you give him one or two beneficial mutations that truly add new information to the genome, Jackson doesn't understand that it's about net gain versus net loss, and beneficials cannot obviously keep up with deleterious mutations. He can provide us with stories, ideas, beliefs, papers that are attempting to explain the problem, explain to solve the problem, but that's all they are, is stories. Near neutrals are virtually unstoppable. Beneficials cannot keep up with deleterious mutations. This is because the influx of deleterious mutations, combined with the fact that beneficial mutations are rare, one or two beneficial mutations are not going to be able to compensate for the information loss. The near neutral mutations are continuously and consistently deleterious. And this is exactly what you'd expect with typographical errors in a text. He also doesn't understand that most beneficial mutations are far too subtle to be selected for by natural selection. I actually explained to Jackson wheat in our debate on modern day debate that mutations in linkage groups, they're linked basically forever. That means if you have lots of bad mutations in that linkage group, and that linkage group is reducing in fitness continuously, and this is based on accumulating deleterious mutations, you can throw in one or two beneficials, but they are just going to get neutralized by the large numbers of deleterious ones. There was no, and there has been no rebuttal to this. The linkage is actually an absolute killer and destroyer for evolution. That only makes the problem worse for them. That means that every linkage group is degenerate. Linkage groups can only get worse and more worse. They can't get better. Now, if there are so many beneficial mutations happening in the human population as Jackson wheat would assert, selection should be able to amplify them. They should be popping up virtually everywhere. What we know, for the most part, about beneficials is that they're largely reductive. They're due to a loss of information. The breaking down of pre-existing systems. Reductive evolution is what we actually observe. Now, we've all seen evolutionists admit it. Beneficial mutations are rare. They can't compensate for the net loss of information. Natural selection is severely constrained by what is known as selection interference. Selecting for one trait interferes with selecting for another trait. This is why his claims about natural selection are more of talking points, but not actually based on facts. Think about it. When you have billions of traits segregating in the population, then the selection process starts to work against itself, which means you end up with being able to only select the best and worst mutations. Now, what Jackson looks to is a trade-off. I have had numerous debates with some of the best evolutionary proponents. Check out my debates, which I will have posted in the description box of this video. Trade-off is what they say. It's been refuted over and over again. What do we know? We know that the genome is degenerating. And although a few nucleotide sites may be improving, massive numbers are being degraded. What does this indicate? Well, this type of trade-off that wheat and other evolutionary proponents look to is not sustainable. This is a fact, because it will result in a shrinking functional genome size. So to make it simple, what's going on is that you're throwing out lots of information from lots of nucleotide sites, and then you're trying to replace all that information with a single desirable point mutation. Now, most beneficials, as I've stated earlier, they're reductive. Things are not being taken forward. They are degrading. Mutation count mechanism, synergistic epistasis, they're not biologically real. For example, mutation count mechanisms. Simulations have disproven this. Synergistic epistasis, extensive numerical simulation experiments have falsified this mechanism. And even with the most generous of settings, this mechanism fails to halt deleterious mutation accumulation. To conclude here, the majority of beneficial mutations will escape positive selection. And then the few rare beneficials that Jackson can point to are either due to general adaptation or through a loss and breaking down of pre-existing information. These few beneficials, they'll have a high impact, but these isolated high impact beneficials will only allow for adaptive episodes. These rare anomalies that the atheist can point to, that Jackson Wheat has pointed to and has been corrected on over and over again, they happen even while the rest of the genome is undergoing systematic degeneration.
Now, Jackson thinks that because Kimura's mathematical simulation shows that beneficial mutations can offset the harmful ones, then obviously genetic entropy cannot be true. But this is not the case. Here, let me explain, just so it's easy for everyone. You see, when they noticed that all it took was 2% beneficial mutations to override the deleterious ones, what you should know is that this was not an observation. This was in a mathematical model. So it works in the math because it's an arbitrary number representing no actual beneficial mutation. It's just a number. So to say it's an anti-cancer mutation and it rids the body of cancer, then yes, that one mutation would negate the harmful. But this is obviously not what we see in reality. Think about it like this. Pac-Man is alone in a maze. He represents a beneficial mutation. Life is easy. This would have been original man, or Adam's genome. But the next generation, there are deleterious mutations represented as a ghost. No problem, the genome is huge, and Pac-Man can avoid it easily. Next generation, 2 ghosts, or 2 mutations. Still not a problem. However, many generations later, Pac-Man now has a problem, as there are too many mutations, or ghosts, to avoid. So, what they do in the mathematical model is just add another Pac-Man, and poof, the balance is restored. However, what we actually see are mutations everywhere in the human genome, and beneficial mutations are nowhere to be seen to offset any of these. Every known cancer is now linked to a mutation, yet not a single beneficial mutation can counter even one of these. And these so-called neutral mutations that these evolutionists keep referring to are not passive, dormant, or dead mutations. They cause disease and harm, contrary to whatever he may think or believe. What he thinks happens is irrelevant. It's what we see that matters, and de novo mutations do cause disease. And for beneficial mutation to offset the harmful ones, it has to be extremely beneficial to override the harmful. So just as strong as the deleterious cancer-causing mutation is, therefore there would have to be a beneficial mutation at the same level to counterbalance things, and there is not. So who cares what Jackson blathers on about to his sheep audience? So in closing, this is why Kimura's mathematical simulation is a failure and unrealistic when compared to the real-world test. This is why John Sanford said Kimura would have drawn a diagram the same way he did, because observational science shows the exact opposite of the mathematical simulation. And who would know better? Someone in the field longer than even Jackson has been alive, with over 70 peer-reviewed published studies on the subject? But we all know he will probably hold firm to the assumption rather than the evidence. It's what evolutionists do best, to rationalize the belief that they hold on to.